Section 1. The town that time forgot Springfield's frozen clock. Bart Simpson is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old since the 17th of December 1989. That was the day The Simpsons first aired on American television. And on that day, Bart was 10. He was small and spiky-haired and full of energy that his parents could not contain, and his teachers could not redirect, and Springfield itself could barely tolerate. He was 10 years old then. He is 10 years old right now. He will be 10 years old when you come back to watch this tomorrow night. Nothing about him has changed. His sister Lisa was 8 in 1989. She is still 8. She is still reading books that are too advanced for her grade level and playing saxophone in a school band that doesn't appreciate what it has. And she is still fighting battles against adults who should know better but consistently don't. She has been doing this for 36 years without aging a single day. Maggie was a baby in 1989. She is still a baby. She still holds that pacifier. She still rides in the back seat of the family car with that wide, unreadable expression on her face. She still cannot form a coherent sentence, at least not one that anyone in Springfield has ever managed to hear. She has been 1 year old for longer than most of the people watching this video have been alive. Homer was in his mid-30s. He still is. He still has that small ring of dark hair circling a bald head that has absorbed more impacts, more falls, more completely unreasonable physical trauma than any skull in the history of fiction. He still works at the nuclear power plant. He still drives to work the same way. He still comes home in the evening, drops onto the same couch, watches the same television in the same living room, and by the time the credits roll, nothing has changed. Marge still has that tower of blue hair rising straight up from her head, defying gravity in a way that suggests either an extraordinary volume of hairspray or something far stranger operating in the atmosphere above Springfield. She still wears the same red dress on special occasions. She still worries about everything in a low, humming undercurrent of anxiety that holds the entire family together like invisible thread. 36 years, 788 episodes, dozens of countries referenced, hundreds of guest appearances, a film, multiple video games, merchandise on every continent, theme parks built in honor of a town that does not appear on any map. And in all that time, not a single resident of Springfield has aged one day. Now, most people who have thought about this at all have filed it away under a simple explanation. It is a cartoon. That is just how cartoons work. You do not expect Bugs Bunny to develop crow's feet, and you do not expect The Simpsons to hold birthday parties where the candle count actually increases. The floating timeline is a standard production tool, a convenience that allows shows to stay in perpetual present tense without the complications that come with characters who age and change and eventually have to be written off the series because they have become too old for the storylines. To work. That explanation is true as far as it goes. But The Simpsons has been running so long, and the writers have been so careful to fill the show with internal logic and recurring details and a kind of lived-in consistency that feels almost real, that the floating timeline has stopped being a simple convenience and started being something that demands a better answer. Because when you look at it closely, when you really sit with the implications of what it means for a town full of people to exist in a permanent present, the questions that come up are not questions about animation budgets or writers' rooms. They are questions about what Springfield actually is. So let's start with the most obvious thing, the thing that everyone sees but almost nobody stops to fully examine. The past in Springfield is not fixed. Homer and Marge have a backstory. They have a history. They met somewhere at some point under circumstances that the show has returned to many times over the years. In the earliest seasons, that backstory was anchored firmly in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Homer and Marge were teenagers during the era of disco and Watergate. Their first date had the texture of that particular cultural moment. The music playing in the background, the clothing they wore, the references they made, all of it was consistent with two people who had come of age during a specific and identifiable period of American history. But the floating timeline does not allow that to stay fixed. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s, and if the present year is whatever year the episode happens to be airing, then their high school years have to keep moving forward in time to remain mathematically plausible. By the 1990s, their backstory had shifted into the late 70s and early 80s. By the 2000s, their formative years had migrated into the late 80s and early 90s. By the 2010s, the show was writing flashback episodes that placed Homer and Marge's teenage years in a context that involved grunge music and early internet culture. The show has retold their origin story at least 4 times, and each version takes place in a different decade. The people are the same. The love story beats are recognizable. But the era keeps sliding, and every new version of the past quietly invalidates the previous one, and nobody in Springfield seems to notice or care. This creates something genuinely strange. Homer and Marge do not have a fixed history. They have a collection of possible histories, each one tailored to whatever decade the current episode needed them to have grown up in. Their memories are not stable records of a shared past. They are drafts that get revised whenever the plot requires it. The characters have the emotional weight of people with real histories, but the actual content of those histories is perpetually in flux, perpetually being rewritten to serve the needs of the present. When you frame it that way, the floating timeline stops being a production convenience and starts sounding like something else, something more unsettling. Let's bring in one of the most popular theories about what Springfield actually is, because it changes the meaning of the aging problem completely. In April of 1993, Homer Simpson fell into a coma. The details of how this happened are part of a longer conversation we will have in a later section, but the essential fact is this: Homer was in a hospital bed, clinically unconscious, and the show acknowledged in explicit terms that he lost brain function during the event. A percentage of his mental capacity was gone, destroyed, and the show said this and then moved on as if it had not said anything particularly significant. The theory, which has circulated among Simpsons fans for years, is that Homer never actually woke up. Everything that has aired since that 1993 episode, every storyline, every guest appearance, every increasingly surreal plot development, every impossible survival from impossible physical trauma, every celebrity Homer meets, every exotic country he visits, every job he holds, is a dream generated by the mind of a man lying unconscious in a hospital bed somewhere in Springfield, slowly losing brain function while the world outside his head keeps moving without him. Under this theory, the aging problem has the simplest possible explanation. Nobody ages because Homer's unconscious mind cannot imagine them aging. The last time he saw his children, Bart was 10 and Lisa was 8, and Maggie was a baby. His brain has no reference material for what they would look like as 11-year-olds or 9-year-olds or toddlers, because the coma took hold before he could accumulate those memories. So the dream keeps them frozen at the last age he knew them. Not because time has stopped, but because memory has stopped, and the dream is built entirely from memory. Marge does not age because the last time Homer looked at her before the vending machine fell, she looked exactly the way she looks in every episode. His unconscious mind renders her faithfully to the last image he has of her, and that image never updates because he is not awake to create new ones. His friends stay the same, his house stays the same. Springfield stays the same, because all of it is constructed from the impression of the world that Homer carried into the coma with him, and impressions do not update themselves. This is, in its way, one of the most emotionally devastating explanations for a piece of animated television that has ever been constructed. But set that aside for a moment, because the coma theory is not the only framework that makes sense of the aging problem. The radiation theory, which we will examine at length in the next section, offers a biological explanation. If the Springfield nuclear power plant has been leaking radioactive contamination into the water supply, the soil, and the air for decades, and if that contamination has altered the fundamental biology of every person living in the town, then the absence of aging is a symptom of mutation. The cellular machinery that drives biological aging has been disrupted by radiation exposure at a level that simply does not happen to normal human beings living in a normal environment. The evidence for this, once you start looking, is considerable. But the point here is structural. Multiple independent theories, built from different kinds of evidence, arrive at the same explanatory endpoint. Nobody ages. And the reason nobody ages is not because the writers are lazy. It is because something about Springfield has broken the normal rules of how living things move through time. Now consider what that actually means for the experience of watching the show. There is a particular episode from the 6th season called Lisa's Wedding. If you have seen it, you probably remember it, because it is one of the most genuinely moving things the show has ever done. In it, a fortune teller at a Renaissance fair shows Lisa a vision of her future. She is in her early 20s, She is at Oxford in England, engaged to be married to a charming young man who loves her in the careful, considerate way that Lisa has always deserved to be loved. She is smart and accomplished and, in the way that Lisa is always slightly lonely, still a little isolated from the world around her. Homer is older in this vision. He is heavier, his hair is thinner. He is still fundamentally Homer, still impulsive and sentimental and a little bit oblivious, but time has done things to him that you can see in his face and hear in his voice. He is a version of the character that the show is capable of imagining, but is not willing to commit to. Because when the episode ends, the fortune teller's vision closes, and Lisa goes back to being 8 years old. Homer goes back to being in his 30s. The future that was so carefully imagined for 20 minutes is locked away, and the present resumes, and everything continues as it was. The show can imagine its characters aging. It has demonstrated this. It knows what Lisa looks like as a young woman. It knows what Homer looks like when time has had its way with him. It has visited that future and rendered it with real emotional care. But it returns from that visit every single time, pulls the door shut behind it, and reinstates the frozen present as if the glimpse never happened. There are readers of this script right now who watched Lisa's Wedding when it first aired in 1995 and are now themselves roughly the age that future Lisa was in that episode. They have grown up, Lisa has not. They went to school, got jobs, had relationships, experienced loss and joy, and the accumulation of everything that life does to a person over decades. Lisa has been sitting in the 4th grade for the entire time, playing the same saxophone, arguing with the same brother, worrying about the same things. This is the most quietly strange thing about the show, stranger than any individual mystery or theory. The audience ages around The Simpsons the way a river ages around a fixed stone. The world keeps moving. Springfield stays still. And the question the show never answers, the question underneath all the other questions, is whether that stillness is a gift or a trap. Think about the specific details of the world around Springfield that change while the town itself does not. Technology has changed dramatically. In the earliest seasons, the family had a large, boxy television set and a VCR and a car that was contemporary to the late 80s. By the mid-90s, there were computers in the episodes. By the 2000s, the internet had arrived in Springfield. By the 10s, smartphones were in the hands of the characters. The show updates its technology to match the present moment while keeping its characters frozen in a state of permanent youth. This creates a particular kind of dislocation. Homer is in his mid-30s, but the phone in his pocket could not have existed when he was born under any consistent version of the timeline. The technology is contemporary. The characters are not. Springfield exists in the present moment technologically while being stuck in a permanent past biologically, and the show holds both of these things as true simultaneously without ever acknowledging that they are in conflict. Under the coma theory, this makes a specific kind of sense. Homer's dreaming mind absorbs information from the outside world, from television playing in his hospital room, from conversations happening at his bedside, from ambient cultural noise filtering into the ward. His dream updates its technology because his sleeping ears keep hearing about new technology in the world outside. But his family does not age because his sleeping mind has no way of seeing how they age. The sounds of the world reach him. The image of his family, frozen at the last moment he saw them, does not update. Under the radiation theory, the technology question matters less than the biological one, and the biological answer involves cellular mutation of such a fundamental kind that the normal human aging process has been disrupted in ways that current science cannot fully describe. Under both theories, and under the collective denial framework introduced by the show's most controversial episode, which we will get to in a later section, there is a consistent undercurrent. Springfield is not a normal place. The rules that govern normal places do not fully apply here. The residents of Springfield are not experiencing time the way the rest of the world experiences it, and the question of why is not a question with a simple answer. What is genuinely interesting, and what makes this worth spending 4 hours on in the middle of the night, is that the show has never tried to explain any of this away. Other long-running shows, when confronted with continuity problems or temporal inconsistencies, tend to address them with in-universe explanations, or simply hope the audience forgets. The Simpsons has done the opposite. It has leaned into its impossibilities. It has made them more visible over time, not less. The show draws attention to the fact that nobody ages. Characters occasionally reference how long they have been doing things. The contradictions are not hidden. They are displayed. And the reason the theories exist, the reason millions of people have spent decades trying to construct explanations for what is happening in Springfield, is precisely because the show keeps inviting that scrutiny. The details are too consistent for the inconsistencies to be accidental. The impossibilities are too carefully constructed to be oversights. Something is happening in Springfield. The frozen clock is not a glitch. It is a feature. It is the show's way of telling you that the town operates under different rules than the world outside it, and if you want to understand what those rules are, you have to be willing to go deeper than the surface level. And across the next few hours, that is exactly what we are going to do. We are going to look at the radiation. We are going to sit with the coma. We are going to reopen the Burns shooting case and find that the official verdict does not hold up under examination. We are going to trace the impossible lifespan of the richest man in Springfield and discover that his survival is not a cartoon convenience, but an engineered outcome. We are going to look at Maggie Simpson's silence and find something extraordinary hiding behind it. But all of those things begin here, with the simplest and most fundamental mystery the show has ever posed. Time stopped in Springfield in 1989. Nobody knows why. Nobody in the town has noticed. And as long as the loop keeps turning, as long as Bart stays 10 and Lisa stays 8, and Maggie keeps that pacifier in her mouth, the question hangs in the air over Evergreen Terrace like weather that never quite becomes rain. What happened to Springfield? That is the question. And the answer, or the collection of answers, is where we are spending tonight. So settle in, get comfortable, let the show come to you, the way Springfield always does, slow and familiar and full of things you thought you understood, because you haven't seen all of it yet. If you're still awake after that opening, drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. There is something genuinely wonderful about knowing that people in entirely different time zones are falling asleep to the same theories at the exact same moment. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment to do it. More nights like this one are coming. Section 2. The Poison in the Water, Springfield's Nuclear Contamination Theory. There is a fish in the waters near Springfield. His name is Blinky, and the thing that distinguishes him from every other fish in every other body of water in the fictional world is simple and obvious and impossible to explain away. Blinky has 3 eyes. Not 2, the way fish have always had 2. The way fish evolved to have 2 over hundreds of millions of years of biological development. 3. The 3rd eye sits in the center of his forehead and gives him a look of perpetual, slightly bovine curiosity, as if he has spent his entire aquatic life vaguely surprised by everything he sees, which, given that he can see it from 3 different angles, amounts to quite a lot. Blinky appears in the 2nd season. He is pulled from a river near the nuclear power plant. He immediately becomes a news story. A political candidate uses him as the centerpiece of a campaign against Mr. Burns, arguing that the fish is evidence of environmental contamination coming directly from the plant. Burns is forced to appear on television and eat the fish to demonstrate its harmlessness. The town watches, is vaguely satisfied by this demonstration, and moves on. Nobody tests the water. Nobody conducts any kind of follow-up study on the wildlife in the river. Nobody asks the most obvious question available, which is, if the fish in the water near the power plant have 3 eyes, what is happening to the people who have been drinking water from the same source for years? This is the opening move of what may be the most thoroughly supported fan theory in the history of animated television. The idea that the Springfield nuclear power plant has been slowly, systematically contaminating the entire town, not metaphorically, not as a background joke, but in a literal and consequential way that explains nearly every strange and unexplained detail the show has accumulated across 36 years. Let's begin with what the show tells us directly about the plant, because the canonical evidence is staggering once you lay it out in sequence. The Springfield nuclear power plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns. It is the primary source of electrical power for the entire town. It has been in operation for decades. And by any reasonable measure of industrial safety, it is one of the most dangerous facilities ever depicted in the history of fiction. A surprise safety inspection of the plant uncovered 342 separate violations. 342. The number is presented almost as a throwaway detail, a punchline to a joke about bureaucratic excess, but if you slow down and actually think about what that number implies, the comedy drains out of it pretty quickly. That is not a facility that has been cutting a few corners. That is a facility that has been constructed, operated, and maintained with a casual indifference to safety that would be considered criminal in any functional regulatory environment. The violations themselves, when the show chooses to detail them, are not minor paperwork infractions. There is radioactive waste being dumped directly into local bodies of water. There is radioactive waste being deposited onto children's playgrounds. There is a cracked cooling tower that has been patched, not repaired, patched, with a wad of chewing gum. There are glowing, luminous rats in the bowels of the facility, rats that have absorbed enough radiation from the environment they live in to emit visible light. There is plutonium being used as a paperweight on someone's desk. And then there are the skeletons. The show mentions human skeletons in the basement of the nuclear power plant with the offhand delivery of a detail it does not consider worth explaining. Human remains. In the basement of a working reactor facility. The show notes their presence and moves on, and Springfield moves on, and nobody asks a single question about how bones belonging to human beings ended up in the sublevels of a commercial power generation facility. The man whose job description is specifically and literally to prevent all of this from happening, the person legally responsible for ensuring that this facility does not poison the town it serves, is Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson, whose IQ the show's own creator has placed at 55. Homer Simpson, whose cognitive function was physically reduced during childhood by a crayon that somehow lodged itself in his brain and remained there, undetected, through years of medical checkups in Springfield, reducing his intelligence in measurable ways that the show later makes explicit. Homer Simpson, who sleeps at his workstation, who eats donuts during meltdown warnings, who once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a piece of food into the reactor core to see if it would grow larger. This is the person standing between the Springfield nuclear power plant and catastrophe. He has been standing there for over 30 years. Now here is where the theory starts to develop its full shape. The three-eyed fish is not an isolated anomaly. It is a data point. It is the show showing you what radiation does to the living organisms of Springfield through the most visible and undeniable example possible. A fish with a biological mutation caused by contaminated water. The contamination is in the water. The water runs through the entire town. And the question the show never directly asks but consistently implies through its details is what the same contamination has done to the organisms that have been drinking that water and breathing the air around that cracked cooling tower for their entire lives. Look at the physical characteristics of Springfield's residents. Really look at them. 4 fingers on each hand. This is a detail so universal among Springfield residents that it barely registers as strange, but it is strange. Normal human hands have 5 fingers. Every adult human being walking the streets of Springfield has 4. Every child, every elderly person, every resident, regardless of age, gender, or any other demographic characteristic, has the same 4-fingered hands that deviate from normal human anatomy in the same specific way. The bulging, oversized eyes, the massive overbites, the skull shapes that do not correspond to any standard of human cranial anatomy. The hair that behaves as if it is subject to different physical laws than hair in the rest of the world, forming shapes that cannot be maintained without extraordinary external support, and yet maintain themselves naturally in Springfield residents without any visible effort. And the skin. The yellow skin that covers every resident of Springfield and nobody else. Here is the detail that makes the theory click into place in a way that is difficult to argue with. When the show introduces characters from outside Springfield, they look different. Guest characters, celebrities appearing as themselves, people who have come from elsewhere in the world to visit the town, they are drawn with more naturalistic proportions. Their eyes are a more normal size. Their features are closer to what actual human anatomy produces. The show draws outsiders differently than it draws Springfield residents, and the difference is consistent and reproducible. The standard explanation is artistic. This is just how the show's visual style works. Springfield residents look a certain way, because that is the show's art style, and guest characters from the real world are drawn more realistically to signal their difference. But within the logic of the show's own universe, Within the world where these characters exist as real people living in a real town, there is a visible, observable, consistent physical difference between people who live in Springfield and people who don't. People inside the contamination zone look one way. People outside it look another way. The people inside the zone look mutated. And it is not only the people. The animals in Springfield show the same characteristics. Santa's little helper, the family greyhound, has the same proportional deviations as his owners, the same bulging eyes, the same features that subtly but consistently deviate from normal canine anatomy. Blinky is the most dramatic example, but he is not the only animal in Springfield that shows signs of biological alteration. The contamination does not distinguish between species. It affects every living organism in the zone. The show addresses this most directly, perhaps more directly than it ever intended, in the episode called The Springfield Files. In this episode, Homer sees what he believes is an alien in the woods near Springfield. The entire town becomes convinced that there is extraterrestrial life in the area. FBI agents are called in. The episode builds toward what it presents as a dramatic reveal. The creature Homer saw is not an alien. It is Mr. Burns. Burns, the episode explains, undergoes a weekly medical treatment so extreme in its nature and its consequences that for a period after each session, his body emits a visible green glow. The treatment involves such concentrations of chemicals and radiation therapy that it fundamentally alters his physical appearance for days afterward. He wanders through the woods in a dazed, euphoric state, glowing in the dark, stumbling through the underbrush like something from another world. The town of Springfield sees a glowing figure in the forest and immediately concludes that it must be an alien from outer space. Their first instinct is not to think about radiation, not to think about the power plant that dominates their skyline and has been a visible part of their landscape their entire lives. Their first instinct is extraterrestrial visitation. This is the show being very deliberate about something. The residents of Springfield are surrounded by evidence of radiation exposure at every level of their environment, and they cannot make the connection. The plant is right there. The violations are documented, however incompletely. The three-eyed fish is in the national news, and when they see a man literally glowing in the dark, their minds leap to outer space before they consider the nuclear facility behind him. The denial is not incidental. The denial is the point. And the denial becomes structurally significant when you bring in the movie. In the Simpsons film, the contamination of Springfield reaches a level that the Environmental Protection Agency, a real federal regulatory agency operating within the show's universe, determines to be an existential threat. The decision made by the government is not to remediate the contamination. It is not to fine Mr. Burns. It is not to shut down the power plant. The decision is to seal the entire town under a massive glass dome to prevent its pollution from spreading to the rest of the United States. Think about what this means within the logic of the show. The United States federal government looked at Springfield and concluded that the town itself was so contaminated, so toxic, so fundamentally dangerous to the surrounding environment, that the only viable solution was physical containment. The town is classified not as a community with a pollution problem, but as an environmental hazard requiring quarantine. Springfield is sealed. Every resident inside it is sealed along with it, breathing the same air, drinking the same water, living in the same contamination zone that the government has just decided is too dangerous to be connected to the outside world. The people are inside the dome when it goes up. And then the movie ends and the dome comes down and everything goes back to normal. Because that is what Springfield does. It forgets. It resets. The most catastrophically contaminated town in the history of the United States goes back to being a pleasant, if slightly peculiar, American suburb. Because here is the deeper layer of the radiation theory, the part that ties it to everything else we are going to discuss tonight. The contamination has not only affected the residents' bodies, it has affected their minds. Homer's brain damage is one of the most discussed elements of the show's mythology. The crayon episode makes it explicit that Homer's cognitive function has been reduced from whatever his natural baseline would have been, and the IQ number the show gives him, 55, places him in a range of cognitive impairment so significant that it would make simple daily tasks genuinely difficult for a real person. Homer manages to hold a job, drive a car, maintain relationships, and navigate the demands of daily life. but he does so at a level of intellectual engagement that is, by any clinical standard, severely compromised. The question the show never asks is why. The crayon is part of the answer, but only part. If the water in Springfield has been contaminated with radioactive material for decades, and if chronic low-level radiation exposure is known to cause neurological damage in biological organisms, then Homer's cognitive state is not the result of an individual accident involving a crayon and a child's nostril. It is the result of a lifetime of environmental exposure to a neurological toxin delivered through the water he drinks, the air he breathes, and the workplace he spends 40 or more hours per week inside. And Homer is not alone. The cognitive patterns visible in Springfield's residents are consistent across the population. The townspeople are, as a general rule, easily confused, easily distracted, resistant to learning from experience, prone to collective delusion, and incapable of maintaining focus on uncomfortable truths long enough to act on them. These are not character flaws distributed randomly through a fictional population. They are a pattern. A consistent town-wide pattern of neurological behavior that matches what chronic radiation exposure does to brain tissue. Burns knows this. The show makes this explicit in multiple ways. Burns owns the facility causing the contamination. Burns has personal physicians. Burns undergoes weekly medical treatments specifically designed to manage the effects of radiation on his own body. Burns is, in a very literal sense, the world's leading expert on what radioactive exposure does to biological systems, because he has been managing that process in his own body for longer than most people alive today have been born. He has the resources to understand exactly what his plant is doing to the people downstream from it. He has pharmaceutical infrastructure capable of synthesizing treatments designed to counteract the effects of radiation exposure. He is aware that his own survival depends on precisely managing the radioactive input his body receives, which means he understands the dose-effect relationship between radiation and biological damage in a way that almost nobody else in Springfield could. He knows what the plant is doing to the town. He has always known. And the most chilling element of the radiation theory is not the contamination itself. It is the possibility that the contamination in a town Burns effectively owns and controls, in a town whose economy is built entirely around the power plant, in a town whose residents are too cognitively compromised by their environmental exposure to connect the dots between their yellow skin and their three-eyed fish and their four-fingered hands and the cracked cooling towers, dominating their skyline, serves a function that is not incidental to Burns's operation. A cognitively impaired population does not organize. It does not investigate. It does not ask the questions that would lead to accountability for the richest man in town. A population whose neurological function has been degraded by decades of radiation exposure is, in the most brutal possible sense, a more manageable population than one whose brain tissue has not been compromised. The theory does not require Burns to have deliberately planned this outcome from the beginning. It only requires that he understood what was happening, had the capacity to stop it, and chose not to, because the outcome served his interests well enough that intervention was not worth the cost. That is not science fiction. That is the oldest pattern in the history of industrial capitalism, repeated in Springfield under neon lights and cartoon proportions. The contamination theory also provides an explanation for Homer's employment that goes beyond the simple comic premise of an incompetent man somehow holding a job he clearly cannot perform. When German investors briefly purchased the Springfield plant from Burns, one of the first things they did was assess Homer's performance and fire him. They were business people from outside Springfield. They had not been drinking the water. They had not been breathing the air. Their neurological function was intact. And intact neurological function produced an immediate and clear assessment of Homer as a safety inspector. He was actively dangerous and needed to go. The second thing the Germans did was get an estimate for bringing the facility up to code. The number nearly bankrupted them. Burns bought the plant back. He rehired Homer. A competent safety inspector would shut the plant down. Homer ensures it stays open. The violations continue. The radiation keeps leaking. The water stays contaminated. And Burns retains his monopoly over a town that cannot effectively challenge him because the mechanism of his control over that town is built into the air they breathe and the water they drink. The mutation theory, applied to the full range of physical characteristics visible in Springfield's population, produces a picture that is far more coherent than the art style explanation. Every deviation from normal human anatomy that the show depicts can be mapped onto what extended radiation exposure does to biological development. The four fingers are not a stylistic choice by the animators. They are the show telling you, quietly and persistently, that the people of Springfield have been shaped by something in their environment that is not present anywhere else. The yellow skin is the most visible and most discussed element of this. The show has addressed it directly, in a meta-aware way, through jokes about the character's appearance. But the show's acknowledgement that the residents are yellow does not explain why they are yellow, and the art style answer, while true at a production level, is insufficient as an in-universe explanation. People in Springfield are yellow. People who come from outside Springfield are not. The demarcation is consistent, and the geographic boundary of the yellow skin corresponds almost exactly with the geographic boundary of the area downwind and downstream from the nuclear power plant. There is one more element of the radiation theory that deserves careful attention, because it connects back to the aging problem we discussed in the first section. If the mutation caused by radiation exposure has been deep enough and extensive enough to alter the physical characteristics of every resident of the town, including the number of fingers on their hands and the color of their skin, is it possible that the same mutation has also disrupted the biological aging process? Normal cellular aging involves the progressive shortening of telomeres, the degradation of cellular repair mechanisms, the accumulation of damage that eventually produces the visible signs of getting older. These are biological processes subject to the same molecular machinery that produces the four-fingered hands and the yellow skin. If that machinery has been altered at a fundamental level by decades of radiation exposure, there is no particular reason to assume that the alteration would affect some biological processes and leave others intact. The mutation is not selective. It does not modify appearance while leaving everything else unchanged. It operates at a cellular level that underlies every biological function, including the ones responsible for aging. Springfield's residents do not age because the radiation has done something to their cellular architecture that makes aging as it normally occurs impossible for them. They are frozen, biologically, in the same way that a radiation-damaged cell is frozen, unable to divide and change normally, because the molecular mechanisms that drive that process have been disrupted. It is not a comfortable theory. It is not a theory the show will ever confirm explicitly, because confirming it would require the comedy to stop and the horror to start. But the evidence for it is present in every frame of every episode, built into the visual language of the show, embedded in the details of the plant's violations, and the three-eyed fish and the glowing billionaire wandering through the woods. The poison is in the water. It has always been in the water, and the people of Springfield have been drinking it for 36 years without once stopping to ask why their fish have three eyes. Section 3. The Dreaming Man Homer's Coma and the World Inside His Head. April 1st, 1993. It is worth pausing on the date, because the choice of date matters. The 18th episode of the 4th season of The Simpsons aired on April Fool's Day. The episode was called So It's Come to This? A Simpsons Clip Show. The premise was familiar. Bart plays a series of increasingly escalating pranks on Homer. The pranks build through the episode with the particular kind of cartoon escalation that the show had mastered by that point in its run. Each prank is more dramatic than the last. Each one produces a response from Homer that raises the stakes slightly higher. The prank that changes everything involves a beer can. Bart takes one of Homer's beers to an auto body shop and places it inside an industrial paint shaker. He shakes it for hours. He puts it back in the refrigerator. When Homer finds the can and opens it, the resulting explosion is violent enough to send him to the hospital. So far, so cartoonish. The show has done this kind of physical comedy many times before and would do it many times after. Homer in the hospital is not a new situation. But then something different happens. While Homer is lying in his hospital bed, recovering from the blast, he sees a vending machine across the room. He wants a candy bar. He reaches for the machine. The machine tips. It falls. It lands directly on Homer, and Homer Simpson flatlines. His heart stops. He enters a clinical coma, and the show is explicit about this. He is not sleeping. He is not merely unconscious. He is in a coma, and the medical staff around him treat it with the gravity that state deserves. The episode ends with what appears to be his awakening. Bart, tearful and guilty at his bedside, confesses that the whole chain of events was his fault. Homer springs awake and immediately begins strangling his son. The family laughs, the credits roll, and in its final moments, the episode mentions, almost in passing, that Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. 5%. Gone. Not recoverable. Never coming back. Homer is told this. He laughs. He says he does not know why he is laughing. The family finds this charming. Nobody finds it alarming. The episode ends. The show continues for 32 more years, as if nothing happened, unless nothing did happen, unless the awakening was not real, unless Homer's brain, damaged and oxygen-deprived and losing function by the minute, generated the image of his own awakening because it was the image he most desperately needed to see and has been generating increasingly elaborate images ever since, the way a dreaming mind generates stories that feel absolutely real until the moment you open your eyes. This is the Homer coma theory. It is, in terms of internal consistency, fan engagement, and the sheer weight of supporting evidence that can be drawn from the show itself, the single most developed and most discussed fan theory in the history of The Simpsons. The basic premise is straightforward. Homer did not wake up from his coma on the 1st of April 1993. He has not woken up since. Every episode that has aired after that date is a dream. Let's be careful about what the theory is and is not claiming, because the details matter. The theory is not claiming that the entire run of The Simpsons is a dream sequence. The first 4 seasons, the ones that aired before the coma episode, are generally considered by the theory to be real. They occurred. They happened. The Homer of those early seasons was a real person living a real life in a real, if unusual, town. The Homer who woke up in that hospital room and started strangling Bart is not the same Homer who went into the coma. The one who woke up is a dream construct, a projection of what Homer's damaged brain needed to believe it was seeing. And from that moment forward, the show that aired is not a documentary about Homer's life. It is a broadcast of Homer's dream. The evidence for this begins with a tonal shift that longtime fans of the show have noticed and debated for decades. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons is a particular kind of show. It is a comedy, yes. It is animated, yes. But its storylines are grounded in a recognizable reality. Homer tries to quit drinking. Marge considers whether she might be unhappy in her marriage. Lisa gets a crush on a substitute teacher and feels the particular embarrassment of unrequited feelings for an adult. Bart faces the real academic consequence of his consistent failure to engage with school and comes close to being held back a year. These are human problems. Relatable problems. The situations are exaggerated for comic effect, but they are rooted in the kinds of things real families experience, and the emotional core of the stories is built on that foundation. After the coma episode, the nature of the stories changes. Homer goes to space. This is perhaps the most dramatic single example, but it is emblematic of an entire shift in the show's relationship to plausibility. Homer does not just have an adventure in space. He is recruited by NASA, trained in accelerated fashion, and launched into orbit because a scientist needs someone ordinary enough to make the mission appealing to a television audience that has lost interest in astronauts. This storyline requires the suspension of every kind of disbelief simultaneously. It requires that NASA, a real federal agency, would select Homer Simpson for a space mission. It requires that the training process would be abbreviated enough to accommodate Homer's capabilities. It requires that the mission would proceed and that Homer would survive it. None of this is possible in any recognizable version of reality. But it is exactly the kind of thing a dreaming brain produces. A dreaming brain does not generate realistic scenarios. It generates wish fulfillment, anxiety, emotional processing, and narrative logic that operates by the rules of feeling rather than the rules of physics. Homer goes to space because a part of Homer's unconscious mind wanted to believe that his ordinary life contained the potential for something extraordinary. The dream gives him that. Homer meets God, twice. Homer discovers that his mother, whom he was told was dead, has been alive this entire time and is a fugitive radical who had to leave to protect him. Homer joins a secret society. Homer becomes a successful entrepreneur multiple times. Homer leads a vigilante group. Homer befriends dozens of celebrities. Homer travels to dozens of countries. Homer holds hundreds of different jobs. Not one of these things is possible within the framework of the show's first 4 seasons. They are possible within the framework of an increasingly elaborate dream generated by a damaged brain trying to give its owner the richest, most eventful, most extraordinary life imaginable, because the alternative is nothing at all. The aging problem, which we discussed at length in the first section, is where the coma theory does something that no other theory does with quite the same emotional weight. It does not explain the ageless characters as a biological phenomenon or a cartoon convention. It explains them as a psychological one. Homer's children do not age because Homer cannot imagine them aging. He went into the coma when Bart was 10 and Lisa was 8 and Maggie was a baby. His brain has no template for older versions of his children because he was not there when they became older. His unconscious mind can generate simulations of Bart pulling pranks and getting in trouble and driving Homer to the edge of sanity because Homer accumulated thousands of memories of exactly those experiences before the coma. It can generate simulations of Lisa playing saxophone and arguing for causes and feeling slightly separate from a world that does not fully appreciate her intelligence because Homer had years of experience with exactly that version of his daughter. But it cannot generate an 11-year-old Bart or a 9-year-old Lisa or a walking, talking toddler Maggie because those versions of his children exist only in a future Homer never got to see. The dream preserves its cast at the last age. Homer knew them, not because Springfield has frozen time, but because Homer's memory has frozen time. The difference sounds subtle, but it is not. Under the biological theories, Springfield is a place where time does not work normally. Under the coma theory, Springfield is a place that exists only inside one man's head, and its relationship with time is defined by that man's last waking experience of the world. There is a moment in the show, in the 4th season premiere, that the coma theory has elevated to the status of what might be the most significant single scene in the entire run of the series. 6 months before the coma episode, Homer has a conversation with God. This is presented in the episode Homer the Heretic, and it is handled with the particular lightness the show brings to theological content. Homer decides not to go to church. He stays home. He has the best day of his life, a quiet, undemanding, deeply contented day of doing whatever he wants without obligation or guilt. And then he falls asleep and dreams, and in the dream, God appears to him. They have a conversation. During that conversation, God tells Homer that he will learn the meaning of life, but not yet. God says, with the gentleness of someone delivering information they know will be difficult to receive, that Homer's time is coming. Homer accepts this with the kind of unconcerned good humor he brings to most things, and the episode moves on, and the moment is filed away as a theological joke in a cartoon. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline is precise. God told Homer his time was coming, and 6 months later, Homer's conscious life ended. What the show presented as an offhand remark in a quirky episode about religious observance reads, under the coma theory, as a warning. God was telling Homer that his waking life was approaching its end, that what came next would be different, that the meaning of life Homer was going to learn was not the kind of meaning you accumulate through experience and age, but the kind you encounter when time stops and the dream begins. The celebrity appearances that flood the later seasons of the show are another piece of evidence the theory handles elegantly. The Simpsons in its first few seasons had relatively few outside voices. The guest appearances that did occur were generally tied to the storyline in organic ways. By the mid-90s, the volume of celebrity guests had increased substantially. By the 2000s and beyond, barely an episode aired without a recognizable name from outside the show appearing in Springfield. Musicians, athletes, politicians, actors, directors, scientists. The town became a strange gravitational center that seemed to pull famous people from every walk of life. The real-world explanation involves ratings and cultural cachet, and the show's enormous prestige. All of that is true. But under the coma theory, every celebrity who appears in Springfield is a voice Homer heard through the fog of unconsciousness. Sound reaches comatose patients. The research on this is not fully settled, but there is compelling evidence that patients in comas retain some level of auditory awareness. The television playing in the hospital room, the radio, the conversations happening between visitors at the bedside. a celebrity's name mentioned in a news broadcast, a song playing through a visitor's earbuds. Fragments of the external world filtering into the dark through the medium of sound. Homer's dreaming mind catches these fragments and incorporates them into the simulation. The celebrity shows up in Springfield because Homer's brain heard the name through the ward and built a character around it. The guest appearance is not a cameo, it is a symptom of the dreaming process. Evidence that the external world is still feeding information into the simulation, even as the simulation grows increasingly distant from the reality it is supposed to represent. The show itself has engaged with this theory. In the 34th season, the writers created what was initially described as a deleted scene in which Homer wakes from a long coma, revealing that all the outlandish storylines were dreams. This material was promoted with enough apparent seriousness to generate significant fan discussion before being revealed as a deliberate plant, a piece of false information introduced into the fan community as a hoax. But the fact that the writers created this material, that they animated it, that they gave it enough verisimilitude to be taken seriously, tells you something important about their relationship with the theory. They know it exists. They have read it. They have engaged with it deeply enough to construct a convincing refutation of it in fictional form, and their refutation came wrapped in an episode that showed exactly what the theory describes. Homer waking from a coma and discovering that the world of the show was a dream. They showed you the truth and called it a hoax. The executive producer of the show addressed the theory directly in 2015. He said it was not true. He dismissed it as fan speculation. But the dismissal was a statement, not an argument. It said the theory was wrong without addressing the evidence that made it compelling. It did not explain the tonal shift after season 4. It did not explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. It did not explain why the show has become progressively more detached from the grounded domestic reality of its early seasons in a pattern that corresponds precisely with the gradual deterioration you would expect from a dreaming brain, losing its grip on reality over time. He said it was not true. He did not say why it was not true, and the evidence, patient and accumulative and built into the structure of the show itself, keeps making the same quiet case it has always made. Homer went to sleep in April 1993. He has not woken up. The show you have been watching since then is a love letter from a dreaming man to the family he cannot reach. Every impossible adventure, every celebrity encounter, every recovery from injury that should have been fatal, every reset after a catastrophic event, every episode that ends with Homer finding his way home, they are all the same dream, the same man, the same hospital room, the same family frozen at the last moment he saw them, preserved in the amber of his memory, kept safe in the only way his damaged brain knows how to keep anything safe, by dreaming about them. Every night, for 36 years. Section 4. Who really pulled the trigger? The Burns shooting case reopened. The summer of 1995. Before streaming, before social media, before the internet had reached the majority of American households, The Simpsons did something that had never been attempted by an animated series before. It created a genuine national mystery, a whodunit, a puzzle distributed across an entire country with a prize attached and an entire summer of suspense built around a single question. Who shot Mr. Burns? The episode that set this in motion aired at the end of the 6th season, in the last week of May, 1995. It was called Who Shot Mr. Burns, Part 1. The title was designed to echo a famous question from Dallas, the 80s soap opera whose cliffhanger had dominated American television conversation for an entire off-season 15 years earlier. The Simpsons was planting its flag in that same territory. This was not going to be a regular episode. This was an event. And the event began with Mr. Burns going too far. Burns had always been the show's villain. He was the powerful, ancient, casually cruel billionaire whose ownership of the nuclear plant made him the most significant single figure in Springfield's economy, and therefore its life. But he had generally directed his villainy toward abstract targets, toward Homer or toward institutions, or toward the concept of workers' rights. In Part 1, he becomes something different. He becomes a comprehensive agent of destruction aimed directly at every person in town simultaneously. He steals an oil well discovered beneath Springfield Elementary, cutting off a source of funding that the school desperately needed. He bankrupts the owner of Moe's Tavern. He creates a sinkhole that collapses the Springfield retirement castle. He injures Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, in an encounter that is played for horror rather than comedy. And then, for his culminating act, he constructs a massive mechanical disc and uses it to block out the sun over the entire town. Not as a metaphor, literally. Burns builds a device capable of blocking sunlight from reaching Springfield and uses it to force every resident of the town to buy electricity from his plant because they can no longer rely on natural light for anything. He steals the sun from an entire community of people because he wants more money than he already has. When Smithers, his longtime loyal assistant and the closest thing Burns has to a conscience, objects to this plan and specifically refuses to help execute it, Burns fires him on the spot. Without hesitation. Without ceremony. Smithers, who has devoted his life to Burns's comfort and survival, is dismissed because he expressed a single moral reservation. The final town hall meeting at the end of Part 1 gathers every resident of Springfield in one room with collective fury at Burns and a collective understanding that he has gone too far. The show had spent the episode carefully establishing that every major character had a specific and personal reason to want Burns harmed. Homer, because Burns had never once remembered his name despite years of employment. Bart and Lisa, because their school lost its funding. Grandpa Abraham Simpson, because the retirement home was destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, because he lost his job when the school's budget collapsed. Tito Puente, because the music program was cut. Moe, because his bar was bankrupt. Even Smithers, freshly fired and apparently drinking heavily, was somewhere in that building with a heart full of betrayal. Then Burns collapsed. A gunshot. He staggered to the town sundial and fell, his hands landing on 2 letters. The screen went black. America had an entire summer to think about it. The official answer, delivered in September of 1995, was Maggie Simpson. According to the episode's resolution, Burns encountered Maggie in the parking lot after the town meeting. He attempted to take her lollipop, because this is the kind of thing Burns does, casually taking things from people much smaller than him as a simple expression of his fundamental worldview. In the struggle, his own gun fell from his holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot with his own weapon by a baby. Case closed. Chief Wiggum declared that no jury in the world would convict a baby. The mystery was solved. America was satisfied. The show moved on. But something interesting happens when you start pulling at this particular thread. The national contest Fox ran to identify the shooter was never actually won. The prize was significant. The winner would be animated into a future episode of the show. Thousands of entries were submitted. According to the DVD commentary the producers later released for these episodes, not a single person in the randomly selected sample of contest entries had guessed Maggie as the shooter. Nobody won. The person awarded the prize received a cash payment instead of the animation appearance because they did not have the right answer either. They were selected randomly from the pool. The producers later acknowledged awareness of exactly one person who had correctly identified Maggie, someone who had posted the answer to a Simpsons discussion group online on the night Part 1 aired. This person was using a college internet account. By the time the contest ended and the producers tried to locate them, the account had been deactivated. They had vanished. The producers even included an open invitation in the DVD release for this person to come forward. As far as anyone has been able to determine, they never did. Think carefully about what this contest result means. The show's creators told America that the mystery was solvable from the clues available in Part 1. They promoted a national contest around this premise. They invited the public to engage with the evidence and arrive at the correct conclusion. And when the answer was revealed, essentially nobody had figured it out. The overwhelmingly most common guesses were Homer, Marge, and Smithers. The official answer, the one the show insisted was properly supported by the evidence, was guessed by so close to nobody that the producers could not find a single winner in their sample. Either the clues were not as clear as advertised, or the answer does not follow as logically from them as the show claimed. Let's look at the clues themselves. Burns falls on the sundial with his hands pointing to 2 letters. The show tells us this is W and S, or, from Burns's own perspective looking down at his hands, M and S, standing for Maggie Simpson. This is presented as the central piece of physical evidence connecting Maggie to the crime. But Burns himself, in his waking testimony after recovering from the coma the shooting put him in, stated explicitly that his hands pointing at those letters was not intentional. He did not deliberately position himself to spell out his attacker's initials. He fell. The sundial just happened to be where he landed. The central piece of evidence, the one the show uses to anchor its solution, is described by the victim himself as a coincidence. The most important clue in the most elaborate mystery the show ever constructed was explicitly confirmed by the victim to be meaningless. Then there is the gun. Burns carried a firearm in a holster. Before the shooting, his holster is shown to be empty. The gun was not in his possession at the time of the attack. This means the person who shot Burns used Burns's own weapon, a weapon they had not brought to the confrontation themselves. Whoever pulled the trigger did not plan to shoot Burns. They encountered the gun by chance and used it in a moment of impulse or confusion. This eliminates most of the suspects who were shown with weapons at the town meeting. The people who brought guns were people who had thought about the possibility of violence and prepared for it. The person who shot Burns was someone who had not prepared, who was unarmed, who found themselves holding a gun they had not planned to hold. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this profile. So does every other person at the meeting who was not carrying a weapon. But here is the element that is most difficult to reconcile with the official solution. Before Burns collapsed, his last words were reported as, "Oh, it's you." Read that again? Burns saw his attacker and his response was recognition. Not surprise, not fear, not the alarm you would expect from a man who realizes he is about to be shot. Recognition. The particular, mild acknowledgement of someone you know and do not consider a threat. Oh, it's you. The way you would greet an acquaintance you had not seen in a while. The way you would acknowledge someone whose presence you understand but were not specifically expecting in that moment. Burns barely knows Homer's name, despite Homer working for him for years. He routinely fails to recognize his most familiar employees, but he recognized whoever shot him immediately, with the particular calm of someone encountering a familiar face. Does Burns know Maggie Simpson? Has the show established any relationship between them prior to this episode? Has Burns ever interacted with the youngest Simpson child in a way that would make her face immediately recognizable to him in a moment of crisis? The show does not establish this. Burns's relationship with the Simpson family is primarily with Homer, and even that relationship is defined by Burns's consistent inability to remember Homer's name. The idea that Burns would see a baby in a parking lot and say, "Oh, it's you," as if greeting a familiar acquaintance, does not sit comfortably with everything the show has established about how Burns processes and retains human faces. Season 18 introduces a detail that should have reopened the entire case and did not. Homer, in casual conversation, claims that he was the one who shot Mr. Burns. He says this, on camera, in a way that registers as either a confession or a very specific kind of lie. Nobody investigates. Nobody calls Chief Wiggum. Nobody suggests that the attempted murder of the richest man in town might be worth re-examining given that the man who works for the victim has just announced that he was the perpetrator. The show moves on. Either Homer is making it up, which is consistent with his character and not impossible, or he is telling the truth, which means that the conviction against Maggie was not just improbable but actively wrong. A baby was blamed for a crime committed by her father. The evidence that supported the official conclusion was insufficient, misinterpreted, or manufactured. And the case that was never really solved was closed in a way that served everyone's interests except the truth's. There is an alternate theory about the shooting that has attracted serious attention precisely because it handles several of the evidential problems the official solution does not. The theory centers on Marge. Consider what Marge's situation was at the end of Part 1. Her children's school had been gutted, her family's dog had been injured. The man responsible had stolen the son from the entire community, had demonstrated in the most comprehensive possible way that he was willing to cause catastrophic harm to everyone around him for the sake of a few additional dollars. And Marge is not a passive person. She is the emotional center of the Simpson family, and, more than that, she is the person in the family who is most capable of acting decisively when the people she loves are threatened. The Marge theory rests on something the show actually established in an earlier episode. Burns fell in love with Marge. He became infatuated with her, pursued her, and was ultimately rejected. The infatuation did not entirely go away. If Burns recognized Marge as his attacker, the response, "Oh, it's you," Makes sense in a way it does not when applied to Maggie. Burns knows Marge. Burns has feelings about Marge that are complicated enough that, upon recognizing her in a moment when she was pointing his own gun at him, his response might not be to cry out or to flee, but to look at her with the complicated mixture of recognition and feeling that produces a quiet, "Oh, it's you," rather than a shout. And if Burns chose not to identify Marge as his shooter, if he woke up from his coma and pointed at the sundial and let the interpretation of those letters fall where it would, he may have been protecting her, taking the bullet, as it were, twice, once physically and once legally. Maggie becomes the answer because Maggie is a perfect answer. She cannot be prosecuted. She cannot be imprisoned. She cannot face any consequence for the act whatsoever, which means that the case closes without producing any outcome that disturbs the existing order. Burns is shot. The shooter is identified. The shooter faces no punishment. Everyone goes home. The sun comes back. Springfield resets. If the goal of the investigation was to produce closure rather than truth, blaming Maggie was the most elegant possible solution. And the show, in one of its most carefully constructed ambiguous moments, provides one final image that it presents as confirmation of Maggie's guilt, while simultaneously allowing for the opposite reading. The last shot of part 2 shows Maggie alone in a room. Everyone else has left. She looks around carefully, checking that she is unobserved, and then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. The show wants you to read this as a confession. Maggie did it, and she knows what she did, and she is alone now, and she can let herself acknowledge it. But a baby imitating a gesture is not a confession. Babies imitate. That is one of the most fundamental things babies do. They observe the behavior of the adults and larger people around them, and they replicate it, because replication is how learning happens at that stage of development. If Maggie witnessed someone shooting Burns, she would replicate the gesture later, in a private moment, because that is what babies do with memorable things they see. Maggie imitating the gesture of pulling a trigger tells us that she saw a trigger pulled. It does not tell us whose finger was on it. The alternate endings prove that even the writers were not fully committed to the Maggie solution as an organic conclusion to the mystery they had constructed. A complete alternate ending was animated in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter, fully voiced, fully produced, complete in every detail. This ending was shown to audiences in a later clip show episode and dismissed with a joke about DNA evidence. The joke itself, the one the show uses to dismiss the alternate ending, directly references the O.J. Simpson trial, in which a jury disregarded DNA evidence to reach an acquittal. The show is winking. It is telling you that ignoring evidence happens, that the official answer is not always the right answer, that the machinery of investigation can produce conclusions that serve interests other than truth. An early draft of the scripts had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers considered this option seriously before abandoning it. The answer was not locked in from the beginning. It was revised, reconsidered, and ultimately chosen not because the clues pointed to it, but because it produced the most useful narrative outcome. In a town where every person had a motive, where dozens of people were armed, where the victim had just committed what amounts to crimes against everyone present, only one trigger was pulled. Springfield is not a restrained town. These people form mobs over misunderstandings. They riot over things that do not deserve rioting over. When a bear appears near the neighborhood, they organize an immediate and disproportionate response. When their cable television is threatened, they take to the streets. But when a man steals the sun from their sky and injures their pets and destroys their retirement homes and bankrupts their favorite bar, only one person acts. Maybe the shooting was not spontaneous. Maybe the convergence of motives and proximity and available weapons produced an outcome that was then managed by people with interests in keeping the truth away from the surface. The official answer is Maggie. The show committed to it. The writers stand behind it. But the contest nobody won, the clue the victim said was meaningless, the confession in season 18 that nobody investigated, and the baby whose final gesture could mean everything or nothing depending on how you read it. None of that resolves cleanly. The case was closed. That is not the same as the case being solved. In Springfield, those two things have always been different. Section 5. The Immortal Billionaire. How Mr. Burns has lived over a century. There are details in the show that establish Mr. Burns's age, and they do not agree with each other. This is not unusual. The floating timeline that affects every character in Springfield affects Burns as well. His backstory shifts across episodes. His memories of historical events do not always align with consistent birth year arithmetic, and the show has never committed to a single definitive number when it comes to how old he actually is. It allows the question to remain productively vague, a source of jokes about his extreme antiquity rather than a fixed biographical fact. But the range, even accounting for the flexibility the floating timeline creates, places Burns at an age that no human being has ever reached through biological means alone. The most conservative estimate puts him well past 100. The more expansive readings of the show's own references suggest he could be considerably older. Burns has described personal memories of events from before the turn of the 20th century. He has told stories about the 1910s as first-hand experiences. He has referenced figures from American history as people he knew personally. He is, by any reasonable interpretation of the evidence, far older than any human being alive today, and yet he functions. This is the crucial detail. Burns is not simply ancient in the way a very old person is ancient, frail and confused and operating at reduced capacity. Burns runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates municipal politics with precision and long-term strategic thinking. He orchestrates schemes that require sustained cognitive engagement, anticipation of multiple variables, and a working understanding of contemporary law, finance, and technology. He is, in terms of strategic intelligence and ruthless calculation, arguably the sharpest mind in Springfield. He accomplishes this with a body that is, in its physical form, extremely fragile. His grip strength is negligible. A single gust of wind can knock him over. His physical form is on the verge of collapse at almost all times. But his mind is operating at a level that most people half his age could not match, and he has been operating at that level for longer than any consistent version of the timeline can make coherent under the rules of normal human biology. The show addresses the how of this most directly in the Springfield Files episode we discussed earlier. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment. The treatment is so extreme that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow. It involves concentrations of chemicals and radiation that would be lethal to a normal person. The effect of the treatment lasts for approximately 1 week, and then the treatment must be repeated. Without it, Burns would die. The margin for error is 0. Burns is not maintained by any natural biological process. He is maintained the way a machine is maintained, through scheduled servicing, through regular intervention by a medical and pharmaceutical infrastructure that he personally funds and controls. His survival is not the outcome of healthy living or genetic good fortune. It is an engineered outcome, produced and reproduced weekly by a system specifically designed for the purpose of keeping one very old man alive against all biological probability. And the treatment itself involves radiation. This is worth pausing on. The man who owns a nuclear power plant, whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into the environment surrounding it for decades, is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure to sustain his own biological functions. Burns is not simply profiting from radiation. Burns is powered by it. His body has been so fundamentally altered by a century or more of proximity to nuclear material that it can no longer sustain itself through the normal cellular processes that keep other living organisms alive. It requires external radiation input the way a healthy body requires oxygen. Remove the source and the system shuts down. This creates an almost paradoxical relationship between Burns and the plant. The plant keeps Springfield in electricity. The plant also keeps Burns in something considerably more fundamental than electricity. It keeps him alive. The contamination flowing out of the plant into Springfield's water and air is, at a lower dose and in a different configuration, the same substance that Burns's medical team administers to him weekly to prevent his collapse. The difference between the dose that kills Burns without treatment and the dose that sustains him is the difference between the leaking radiation in Springfield's environment and the precisely calibrated treatments his doctors provide. Springfield gets the uncontrolled version. Burns gets the managed version. The town absorbs the poison. Burns absorbs the medicine. The most famous single scene in the show's depiction of Burns's medical condition is the one in which his doctor informs him that he has every disease known to medical science. Every disease. Simultaneously. The doctor explains that the diseases are in a state of perfect equilibrium within Burns's body, each one preventing the others from gaining dominance. If any single disease progressed, it would kill him. But because they are all present at once, they create a biological gridlock that prevents any one of them from advancing. The doctor calls it Three Stooges syndrome. This is played as comedy. It is one of the most quoted scenes in the show's history. But taken within the framework of what the radiation theory tells us about how Burns has maintained his survival, the scene describes something genuinely remarkable. Burns's diseases are not in equilibrium by accident. The weekly radiation treatments his medical team administers are not curing the diseases. They are managing the equilibrium. They are functioning as a kind of biological control mechanism, maintaining each disease at precisely the level where it is counterbalanced by all the others, preventing any single pathology from gaining the upper hand and collapsing the entire system. Burns's body is, in the most literal possible sense, a reactor. The diseases are the reaction. The weekly treatments are the control rods. Adjust them correctly and the reactor runs indefinitely. Allow them to slip and you get a cascade failure. Smithers' role in Burns's survival cannot be overstated. The show presents Smithers as Burns's devoted assistant, and that is true, but it does not capture the functional reality of what Smithers does. Smithers manages Burns's schedule. Smithers ensures that the weekly appointments happen, that the treatments are administered on time, that the medical protocol is followed with the precision that keeping Burns alive requires. Smithers is not merely emotionally devoted. Smithers is the logistical infrastructure through which Burns's survival is maintained. The show has made it clear multiple times that without Smithers, Burns would be helpless. Not emotionally helpless, physically helpless. If Smithers were removed from his position, if he quit or was fired or was otherwise unavailable, the schedule would fail. The treatments would be missed. The equilibrium that Burns's medical team works to maintain would collapse, and every disease in Burns's body would surge forward simultaneously, unchecked, and Burns would not survive the week. Smithers knows this. This is perhaps the most significant single fact about his relationship with Burns that the show has ever established. Smithers is devoted to Burns not only because he loves him, in whatever complicated and painful way that love expresses itself across their deeply asymmetrical relationship. He is devoted to Burns because his absence is a death sentence. He cannot leave, not really. Not without consequences that go far beyond professional loyalty or personal attachment. If Smithers ever truly abandoned Burns, Burns would be dead within days. That is not a relationship built on affection alone. That is a relationship built on necessity. Burns needs Smithers to stay alive. Smithers knows Burns needs him to stay alive. And the knowledge of that dependency, the awareness that he is the mechanism through which an impossible old man keeps defying biology, is the invisible architecture beneath everything else in their dynamic. Burns's connection to historical events adds a layer of strangeness to the immortality question that the show has explored repeatedly but never fully resolved. He knew Howard Hughes. He attended Yale. He served in the Second World War, in a capacity the show depicts as morally complicated at best and actively villainous at various points. He stole $1 trillion bill from the United States government during the war and kept it hidden for decades. He has referenced the Gilded Age not as something he learned about in school, but as something he experienced personally. His family's wealth predates the Industrial Revolution, and the Burns dynasty extends back through American history to a point before the nation's founding. Burns inherited an empire that was already old when he took control of it. His family had been accumulating wealth and influence for generations before Charles Montgomery Burns was born, and they had been doing so with the kind of success that suggests either extraordinary luck or methods for preserving power across generations that go beyond normal family succession. The show does not answer the question of whether previous Burns patriarchs found ways to extend their lifespans beyond normal limits. It does not tell us whether the methods that currently keep Charles alive are innovations developed during his own lifetime, or refinements of techniques the Burns family has employed for centuries. It leaves the question open, and the openness is itself suggestive. A family that has maintained continuous control over a significant fortune from before the United States existed to the present day is not a family that has done so through luck. That kind of continuity requires active management across generations. And active management of that duration in a family apparently willing to employ biological weapons manufacturing and environmental contamination as business tools, suggests a willingness to employ whatever means are necessary for whatever outcomes are desired. Burns has survived being shot by Maggie Simpson. He has survived multiple hospitalizations. He has survived physical assaults, abandonment in wilderness conditions, poisoning, falls, and the accumulated mechanical failure of a body that has been running for over a century. Each time, he returns. Not through cartoon resilience of the kind that lets Homer Simpson walk away from things that should be fatal. Burns does not simply bounce back. He is reconstructed. He is repaired. The infrastructure of his wealth deploys doctors and facilities and resources to bring him back from the edge each time. Homer survives because the show needs him to. Burns survives because Burns has spent a century building a system specifically designed to produce his survival regardless of circumstances. Homer's immortality is passive. It is a consequence of the show's needs. Burns's immortality is active. It is the product of deliberate, sustained, resourced effort aimed at a single outcome, keeping Burns alive for as long as possible by any means available. And here's the element of the Burns immortality theory that makes it most unsettling. Springfield needs Burns to be alive. The town's economy is built around the power plant. The power plant belongs to Burns. Burns's medical protocol requires the same radiation infrastructure that the plant provides. It is a closed loop, a self-sustaining cycle in which the man, the machine, the contamination, and the treatment all feed each other. The plant keeps the town in electricity. The town's economic dependence on the plant keeps Burns in control. Burns's control over the plant gives him access to the radiation that his medical team uses to keep him alive. His survival ensures the plant continues operating, and the plant's operation ensures the contamination continues, which keeps the town's population in the neurologically compromised state that prevents them from effectively challenging Burns. Everything feeds everything else. Remove one element and the whole system destabilizes. Burns dies and the plant loses its operator. The plant closes and the town loses its economic foundation. The town's economy collapses and the residents scatter or face genuine poverty. The contamination ends and the neurological damage gradually stops accumulating, but the damage already done does not reverse. Springfield cannot afford to let Burns die. It has been unable to afford this for so long that the economic dependency and the biological dependency have become indistinguishable. The town is tethered to its billionaire oppressor the way the billionaire is tethered to his weekly treatments. Neither can exist without the other. Neither can escape the other. Burns is not immortal in the way the word usually means. He has not defeated death. He has simply made himself too expensive to allow to die and surrounded himself with a system of dependencies complex enough that no one element of it can allow the others to fail. He is not the oldest man in Springfield because nature has been kind to him. He is the oldest man in Springfield because he has spent over a century engineering the conditions of his own survival with the same ruthless intelligence he applies to everything else. And Springfield, its water contaminated, its population cognitively compromised, its economy structurally dependent on the plant, its residents too damaged to fully understand the architecture of their own captivity, will keep paying the cost of that survival for as long as Burns keeps the lights on, which, if his treatment schedule holds, may be forever. Section 6. The Silent Genius Maggie Simpson's Secret Intelligence. Maggie Simpson does not talk. This is taken as a given. It is built into the premise of the character and has been there since the beginning. She is a baby. Babies do not talk. The pacifier never comes out of her mouth. Her communication consists of gestures, facial expressions, and the occasional squeaky noise. She is 1 year old, and 1-year-olds do not form sentences. The show has reinforced this reading of Maggie consistently and deliberately. She is the background character. She is the one the camera passes over on its way to someone who is actually doing something. She is cargo. She is the baby that gets carried from scene to scene. She is, if you are watching casually, the least interesting member of the Simpson family by a considerable margin. This is exactly what she wants you to think. Let's begin with the most important single piece of evidence for what Maggie actually is, a theatrical short film released in 2012 called The Longest Daycare. It ran in cinemas before Ice Age, Continental Drift. It is 7 minutes long, it has no dialogue, and it is one of the most quietly remarkable things the show has ever produced. The premise is simple. Maggie is dropped off at the Ayn Rand School for Tots, a daycare facility run with the kind of authoritarian efficiency that would be alarming in a setting for adults and is genuinely disturbing in a setting for infants. The facility categorizes its children immediately upon arrival. The smart babies go in one room, the rest go in another. Maggie is categorized immediately, her intelligence measured and noted by the staff with the brisk efficiency of people who have done this assessment many times. Inside the facility, Maggie encounters a caterpillar on the verge of becoming a butterfly. She wants to protect it. A bully, a baby who has been established in the show's mythology as Maggie's recurring infant nemesis, wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature action film in which Maggie systematically outmaneuvers the bully, the daycare staff, and the facility's security measures to save the butterfly and release it into the world. She does this without saying a single word. She does it without walking reliably. She does it with the motor skills of a 1-year-old, which means she falls, she stumbles, she crawls when the situation demands running, and she improvises around her physical limitations with the adaptability of someone whose mind is operating far faster than her body can keep up with. She reads the physical environment and identifies what she needs. She observes the behavior of other people and anticipates what they are going to do before they do it. She develops multi-step plans that require an understanding of spatial relationships, timing, and the predictable patterns of other people's behavior. She executes those plans with the kind of precise decision-making that adults struggle with, because making the right call under pressure while working with limited physical capabilities requires not just intelligence, but the particular kind of intelligence that can work around constraints and find solutions in unexpected places. Maggie's decision-making across those 7 minutes is essentially flawless. Every choice she makes is the correct one. Every adaptation she makes in response to new information is optimized. She does not waste motion. She does not make avoidable mistakes. She operates at a cognitive level that her physical form simply cannot match, and she finds ways to compensate for every limitation her body imposes through the sheer quality of her thinking. The show has also tested Maggie's intelligence directly within the canon of the regular series, and the results are consistent with what The Longest Daycare implies. When Maggie has been subjected to infant intelligence assessments, the results are extraordinary. In some episodes, the numbers are played for quick laughs and then dropped, but the pattern they establish is unmistakable. Maggie is not a normal baby. Her intelligence, as measured by the tools available to the characters who test it, registers as exceptional in ways that the characters around her consistently fail to take seriously. This failure of the characters to take Maggie seriously is itself a piece of evidence. The people around Maggie, her family, the residents of Springfield, the people who interact with her daily, see a baby. They see a 1-year-old in a onesie with a pacifier, and their assumptions about what babies are and what babies can do ensure that they never look past the surface long enough to see what is actually there. And Maggie has never done anything to challenge those assumptions. This is the crucial point. Her first word was voiced by Elizabeth Taylor. It happened once. It was an event. The show treated it as a significant moment in the character's history. And then it never happened again. Maggie, who demonstrated in that single moment the ability to form a coherent English word and direct it with emotional precision, chose not to speak again. In 36 years, she has not developed language in any way that the people around her can perceive. She is surrounded by a family that never stops talking. Homer provides a constant stream of impulsive commentary on everything happening around him, often simultaneously with things happening to him. Marge narrates her own anxiety in a low, continuous undercurrent that surfaces whenever the silence gets too deep. Bart generates noise the way a small engine generates heat, as a natural byproduct of simply existing. Lisa talks because she has things to say and nobody else is saying them, and the silence of intelligence unacknowledged is a particular kind of torment. The Simpson household is one of the loudest domestic environments in the history of American television, and Maggie sits in the middle of it, silent. She is not silent because she cannot speak. The show has established that she can. She is silent because she has decided not to. The theory, which the evidence supports more thoroughly than most fan theories get to be supported, is that Maggie's silence is a strategic choice made by an intelligence sophisticated enough to understand what speaking costs in the environment she occupies. Look at what happens to the intelligent women in the Simpson family. Look at Lisa. Lisa Simpson is brilliant. This is not a matter of opinion within the show's universe. It is established repeatedly, tested, confirmed, and treated by the narrative as a fundamental fact about the character. Lisa has an IQ that dwarfs every other member of her household and most adults in Springfield. She is, by every available measure, the smartest person in her immediate environment. And what does that intelligence get her? Isolation, mockery, dismissal. She speaks up and gets ignored. She challenges authority and gets punished. She identifies problems that actually exist, proposes solutions that would actually work, and is consistently overruled by a community that values conformity more than correctness. She is the most intellectually capable person in the room, in almost every room she enters, and the rooms consistently respond to this by making sure she knows how little it matters. Lisa's intelligence is on the outside. It announces itself, it claims space, it demands to be acknowledged. And Springfield, which has collectively decided not to acknowledge uncomfortable things, treats Lisa's intelligence as one of those uncomfortable things. Her brilliance is a disruption. It reminds people of the gap between what is possible and what they have settled for. And rather than close the gap, they manage the disruption. Maggie has been watching this happen since the day she was born. She was there, in the back seat or in the playpen or in the high chair, while Lisa fought and lost and fought again and lost again. She observed, with the particular attentiveness of someone who cannot yet participate but can certainly perceive, the consistent outcome of visible intelligence in this family. She watched her sister use her mind openly and be punished for it. And Maggie drew a conclusion. Silence is armor. Invisibility is power. The less they notice you, the more you can accomplish. Pretend to be what they expect you to be. Small and helpless and entirely absorbed in your pacifier, and you can operate in the margins, unobserved, without interference, for as long as you choose to maintain the disguise. The disguise is the performance of exactly the baby everyone already assumes she is. She performs helplessness. She performs cognitive limitation. She performs the ordinary blankness of infant existence, and the performance is so consistent and so convincing that it has lasted for 36 years without being penetrated. Consider the effects of this strategy. When Burns was shot, the investigation focused immediately on the adult suspects, the people with established motives and the physical capability to be taken seriously as perpetrators. Maggie was identified late in the process, almost as an afterthought, after the more plausible suspects had been cleared or complicated. And when she was identified, the conclusion was almost immediate. No jury would convict a baby. Case closed. A shooting investigation was resolved in Maggie's favor, not because anyone examined the evidence carefully and determined her innocence, but because her age made accountability impossible. The most protected category of person in the legal system is, paradoxically, the most powerful position to occupy if you want to do something and face no consequences. Maggie occupies that position, and she has occupied it for 36 years. The daycare rebellion, which is established in the show's canon, follows the same logic. Nobody monitors infants with any serious attention because infants are assumed to be incapable of organization. The assumption creates the blind spot. The blind spot creates the opportunity. And Maggie, whose intelligence far exceeds the assumptions that produce the blind spot, exploits the opportunity with the systematic thoroughness of someone who planned for it. The show's connection of Maggie to the radiation theory is one of the more striking elements of the broader theoretical framework. If Burns's contamination has affected every resident of Springfield in ways consistent with radiation mutation, and if the mutation does not affect every individual identically, then Maggie and Homer represent the opposite poles of the distribution. Homer's mutation reduced his cognitive capacity. His intelligence, whatever it would have been in an uncontaminated environment, was diminished by a combination of radiation exposure, physical brain damage, and the accumulated neurological effects of decades in a contaminated environment. Maggie's mutation may have amplified hers. Same source, same family, same contaminated air and water and soil. But where the father's brain was diminished, the youngest daughter's was enhanced. Where the radiation took something from Homer, it gave something to Maggie, an extraordinary cognitive capacity that emerged from the same environmental event that damaged everyone else around her. The radiation theory in most of its applications tells a story of loss. of what Springfield's contamination has taken from its residents, of the potential that was diminished, the intelligence that was reduced, the critical thinking that was compromised. Maggie may be the exception. She may be what the radiation looks like when it does not diminish but amplifies. The outlier in the distribution. The data point that makes the theory three-dimensional by demonstrating that the same cause can produce opposite effects in different individuals. Under the coma theory, Maggie's genius takes on a different kind of meaning. If Homer is dreaming, if everything in Springfield since 1993 is the product of an unconscious mind generating its ideal world from the fragments of the life it left behind, then Maggie's extraordinary intelligence is Homer's most revealing hope. Homer cannot see Maggie grow up. He cannot watch her become the person she will become. He cannot hear her speak in full sentences or see her walk without falling, or know what kind of adult she is eventually going to be. His coma took all of that from him. He went under when she was 1 year old, and she has been 1 year old in his dream ever since. But the dream gives her this. It gives her the intelligence that surpasses everyone around her. It makes her capable of things no actual 1-year-old could do. It renders her as someone who, even without the ability to articulate it, is going to be extraordinary, because Homer needs to believe this. He needs the reassurance, generated by his own dreaming mind, that the smallest person in his family is also in some sense the most capable, that even in his absence, even without him there to protect her, she is going to be okay. Her genius is not a mutation. In this reading, it is a father's hope, the thing a dreaming man gives the child he cannot reach. But outside the coma theory, in the waking world of Springfield, if there is a waking world, there remains the question that the show has never answered and may never answer. What is Maggie waiting for? She watches everything. She understands everything. She processes the world around her at a level that nobody in that world is equipped to recognize or respond to, and she waits. She has been waiting for 36 years. What she is waiting for, what the threshold is that will finally prompt her to break the silence and reveal what has been accumulating behind that blank baby stare, the show has not told us. But we have seen glimpses of what she is capable of. We have seen her shoot a man and face no consequences. We have seen her organize a room full of babies against a tyrannical caretaker. We have seen her solve problems that stump adults 3 times her age. We have seen her confirm innocence and suggest guilt with the smallest of movements. The family trusts her judgment. They trust it more than they fully articulate or perhaps even consciously recognize. When Maggie communicates something, the people around her respond to it even when they cannot explain why. Maggie Simpson has been the most capable person in her family for 36 years. She just has not decided it is time to let anyone know that yet. And that decision, when it comes, will probably not look the way anyone expects, because that is how Maggie operates, below the radar, in the margins, exactly where nobody is looking. She has been practicing for decades. Section 7, The Woman Who Started Everything, Mona Simpson's Conspiracy. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. This was the established fact, the background detail that explained an absence without requiring examination. Homer had grown up without his mother. Abe Simpson had told him she passed away when Homer was young. There was a grave. Homer had mourned. He had processed the loss in whatever way Homer processes things, and had filed it in the category of formative facts about his life. He was a boy whose mother died and whose father was too emotionally closed off to adequately fill the space she left. Homer's entire personality, examined closely, is a map of that absence. His desperate need to be liked, to be noticed, to be approved of by everyone around him, his terror of being left alone, his clinginess toward Marge, the way he holds on to her in moments of insecurity with the particular intensity of someone who knows what it feels like when the most important person in the world is suddenly gone. His willingness to absorb humiliation and disrespect from his employer rather than risk losing the one stable thing in his life. His compulsive generosity toward people who do not necessarily deserve it. All of it, when you trace it back far enough, leads to a grave marker in Springfield that Homer grew up visiting. A grave that, it turned out in the 7th season, was not his mother's. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired in November of 1995, and it is considered by many fans and critics to be one of the finest episodes the show has ever produced. It begins with a joke. Homer fakes his own death to avoid working on a Saturday, pushing a dummy off a cliff near the power plant. The town believes he is dead. Marge, with the particular exasperated competence that defines her, insists he visit the Hall of Records and correct the error before it causes administrative complications. At the Hall of Records, Homer discovers that his mother is listed as alive. She never died. The grave Abe showed him was not hers. It was, the show reveals with characteristic absurdist specificity, the grave of Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe Simpson had been using a famous writer's headstone as a prop in a lie about his wife's death for Homer's entire life. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery, visiting what she believes is his grave. She does not recognize him at first. He is grown. He is the person he became in her absence, which is a very different person from the child she left behind. When Homer proves who he is, the reunion that follows is one of the show's most genuinely emotional scenes. A grown man and his mother, separated for 27 years, finding each other beside a headstone that belongs to neither of them. And then Mona explains. She did not die. She did not leave because she stopped loving Homer. She left because Burns took everything from her except the ability to run. Because the alternative to running was a prison sentence. Because staying would have put Homer and Abe in danger. Because she was a fugitive, and fugitives cannot have families, and Burns made her a fugitive. The story begins in 1969. Mona Simpson at that point was a housewife in Springfield. She was married to Abe. She had a young son named Homer. She was, by her own description, ordinary, unremarkable. Living a quiet domestic life while the world outside Springfield was convulsing through social upheaval, counterculture, Vietnam protests, the civil rights movement, and then she changed. The show depicts this with the lightness it generally brings to politically charged content, but it also takes the substance of it seriously. Mona was radicalized by what was happening in the world around her. She joined a group of activists, and that group identified a target, a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Sit with that for a moment. Burns owned a nuclear power plant. This we already knew, but Burns also owned a germ warfare facility in Springfield, a laboratory designed to produce biological weapons, in the same town where Homer was growing up, where children were going to school, where families were living their lives in what they believed was an ordinary American suburb. The richest man in Springfield was manufacturing weaponized pathogens a few miles from the houses of the people who worked for him. Mona and her group broke into the laboratory. They destroyed the biological agent stored inside, using what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb. They succeeded. The weapons were gone. And during the chaos of the escape, Mona stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the commotion. That someone was Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, and Burns saw her face. He identified her. He reported her to the FBI. And from that moment, Mona Simpson's life as a woman who could exist in the world ended. She could not go home. She could not call. She could not explain to her husband why she was disappearing, or to her son why he was waking up to find her gone. She kissed Homer while he was sleeping and walked out into the night. She was 27 years old, approximately. Homer was 6 or thereabouts. He woke up and she was not there. Abe told him she was dead. And Homer spent the next 27 years carrying the particular weight of believing he had been a son whose mother preferred death to staying. Believing, in whatever part of a child's mind makes these calculations, that there must have been something wrong with him. Something about him that made a mother who could not otherwise be made to leave choose to go. The damage this did to Homer Simpson is the damage that explains Homer Simpson. Every quirk, every insecurity, every compulsive behavior that the show has used to build the character across decades, all of it roots back to a 6-year-old boy who woke up one morning and found that his mother was gone. Burns did not pull a trigger. He did not commit any single dramatic act of violence against Homer directly. What he did was take Homer's mother away from him at the age when losing a mother causes the most permanent and most comprehensive psychological damage possible. And then, in a detail that the show reveals and that Homer himself seems unable to fully process, he employed the grown version of that damaged child as his safety inspector at the very facility that contaminated the environment Homer grew up in. Homer works for the man who destroyed his family. He has worked for him his entire adult life. He earns his paycheck from the person responsible for the absence that shaped everything about who he is. And Homer, whose cognitive function has been compromised by the combination of radiation exposure and physical brain damage and the psychological weight of the losses he has sustained, cannot fully make this connection. He knows it, on some level. The show has given him the information, Mona told him. The story is laid out, but knowing something and integrating it into a coherent understanding of how your life has been shaped by the decisions of a powerful person who damaged your family, those are different cognitive tasks. The second one requires a kind of sustained, analytical thinking that Homer's brain, in its current state, cannot sustain. The conspiracy widens when you examine the deal that was made between Abe Simpson and Burns. The show reveals in a later episode that Burns had committed a crime, and Abe Simpson discovered it. The nature of the crime is less important than the outcome of the discovery. In exchange for Abe's silence about whatever Burns had done, Burns guaranteed Homer a job at the plant, forever, regardless of performance. Regardless of the number of safety violations Homer was responsible for, regardless of the accidents, regardless of the incompetence, Homer Simpson would always have employment at the Springfield nuclear power plant as long as Burns was running it. This is typically presented as an explanation for the otherwise inexplicable fact of Homer's continued employment, despite his spectacular unsuitability for his role. But in the context of Mona's story, it takes on a different shape. Burns forced Mona into exile. Burns sent the FBI after her. Burns used his resources to pursue her for decades, recognizing her through a cab window when she briefly returned to Springfield and immediately calling the authorities, forcing her to flee again, forcing Homer to say goodbye to her for the second time. Burns is directly responsible for the most significant pain in Homer's life, and Abe Simpson made a deal with Burns. Abe, who had covered up the truth about Mona's existence for Homer's entire childhood. Abe, who had shown his son a poet's gravestone and told him his mother was there. Abe made a deal with the man responsible for destroying his family, and the deal guaranteed that Homer would always have a job working for that man. 3 generations of Simpsons, broken and bound by one man's decision to pursue a grudge against a woman who tried to stop him from producing biological weapons. Mona fought against something genuinely wrong. She used drastic means the show does not uncritically endorse, but the target was real, and the act was, by any reasonable standard, morally defensible. She destroyed weapons designed to kill people. She did it at considerable personal cost. She did it knowing she was risking everything, not knowing that everything included her son's psychological well-being for the next 3 decades. Burns's response was to use the full force of his wealth and his connections to ensure that she could never be safe again. Homer is the collateral damage of that conflict. He is the child who was never supposed to know any of it, and who still does not fully know it, not in the integrated way that would allow him to understand his own life as the product of someone else's decisions. The show proves what Homer might have been without this damage. The crayon episode, which we have discussed in other contexts, shows us Homer with his cognitive function restored, the intervention of a device that was limiting his thinking for most of his life. And Homer with his mind restored is a different person. He is thoughtful. He is articulate. He understands the world around him with a clarity that the regular Homer cannot access. He sees his job, his family, his life with new eyes, and what he sees is painful enough that he eventually chooses to return to cognitive limitation, because the alternative is being fully aware of a situation he has no power to change. The man Homer could have been. The man he would have been if Burns had not driven Mona away at the moment in his development when a mother's presence is most irreplaceable. That man exists inside Homer's skull, buried under a crayon and decades of radiation damage and the psychological scar tissue of a childhood wound that never fully healed. Burns did not just take Homer's mother. He took Homer's potential. He took the version of Homer that might have existed if the first formative loss of his life had not happened on the schedule that Burns's decision created. And Homer works for him, every day. Clocking in and clocking out and bringing home a paycheck that comes from the same account as the money that funded the FBI pursuit that kept his mother running for 27 years. Mona died in a later season. The scene is one of the quietest and most genuinely moving things the show has produced. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches her slip away finally, After decades of separation and brief reunions, and the particular grief of knowing that the time together you did get was far less than what should have been possible. No joke, no cutaway, no reset before the next commercial break. Just a man and the mother he barely knew, and the weight of what was taken from both of them pressing down on the moment without relief. The Simpsons is a comedy. This fact is true and important, and the show has never stopped honoring it. But it has also, under the surface of the comedy, been telling a different story. A story about a family that was systematically damaged by one man's power over their lives, starting with an act of cruelty toward a woman who tried to do something right, and ending with a grown man who cannot entirely understand why his life feels so heavy. Burns won. He almost always does. In Springfield, the man with the resources writes the outcome. And the outcome in this case was 3 generations of Simpsons, shaped by a decision Burns made in 1969, when Mona stopped to help a man she did not know was her enemy. Homer inherited the consequences of that moment. He carries them to work every morning through the gates of the plant that belongs to the man who set them all in motion. He has been carrying them for decades, and the weight of them, distributed across 36 years of episodes, is one of the things that makes The Simpsons something more than a cartoon. Section 8. The Lies Springfield tells itself the Tamzarian incident and collective denial. There is an episode of The Simpsons that a significant portion of its fan base has never fully forgiven the show for. It aired on the 28th of September, 1997, Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper, and the backlash it generated was immediate, intense, and has not fully subsided in the nearly 3 decades since it aired. Harry Shearer, who provides the voice for both Principal Skinner and Mr. Burns among many other characters, publicly expressed his displeasure with the episode. Critics called it a betrayal of the show's own mythology. Fans ranked it among the worst episodes ever produced. It is cited regularly as a turning point, the moment the writers stopped caring about continuity, the moment the show's relationship with its own history broke down. But here is the thing. The Principal and the Pauper is not a failure. It is a diagnosis. It is the one episode in the show's history that lets you watch Springfield's fundamental operating principle in real time, openly, without the usual layer of comedy softening what is actually happening. It is the show saying the quiet part loud. To understand why, you need to know what happens. Springfield Elementary holds an event to honor Principal Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. It is a ceremony, a celebration of a man who has been a fixture of Springfield's educational and community life for 2 decades. The town gathers. The speeches are made. The sentiment is genuine, in Springfield's particular way of generating sentiment, which is simultaneously sincere and slightly incapable of sustaining sincerity for more than a few moments at a time. And then a stranger walks in. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war in Southeast Asia, held for years, presumed dead, and who survived and escaped and made his way home to discover that someone had been living his life for the past 20 years. The man Springfield has known as Principal Skinner for 2 decades is revealed to be an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before the war, he was a street punk from the wrong side of whatever counts as the wrong side of things in Springfield's socioeconomic geography. He was a petty criminal with no particular future and no particular direction. He was drafted. He ended up in the same unit as the real Seymour Skinner, a unit that was captured in Vietnam, and when Skinner was taken prisoner and presumed killed, Tamzarian felt something that the show treats with more seriousness than it treats most things: guilt. He went to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to Skinner's mother, Agnes. But when he arrived, Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. And Armin Tamzarian, who had never been wanted by anyone, who had never had a home or an identity or a reason to stay anywhere, just let it happen. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the history, the mother, the life. He built a new identity from the materials of someone else's and wore it for 20 years until the person it actually belonged to walked through the door. Now here is what happens next. And this is the part that matters. The town holds a meeting. The real Skinner is present. Tamzarian is present. The truth is fully exposed in front of everyone. Springfield knows, definitively, with no room for doubt, that the man who has been running their school and attending their social events and participating in their community for 2 decades is not who he said he was. They know his real name. They know his real history. They know about the lie. And then the town votes, not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian, not on how to restore the real Skinner's identity, not on what legal or social consequences should follow from a 20-year deception of this magnitude. They vote on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The vote is not close. The town decides unanimously to pretend the revelation never happened. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree that the imposter is the real Skinner. He declares by judicial authority that the fiction is the fact and the fact is the fiction. The real Seymour Skinner, the actual war hero who survived a prisoner of war camp and came home to find his life stolen, is physically tied to a railroad car and expelled from Springfield. And Judge Snyder makes it explicitly illegal, under penalty of torture, to ever mention the truth again. Read that again, slowly. The town collectively decided that their comfort was more important than reality. They had proof, standing in front of them in human form, that their version of events was wrong, and they chose their version. They chose the lie. They sentenced the truth to exile and criminalized the act of speaking it. Fans responded to this episode as though the writers had done something to the show, as though an outside force had broken the internal consistency that the series had spent 8 seasons building. The assumption was that this was a failure of craft, a decision to discard the established mythology for the sake of a cheap story. But here is what that response misses. Springfield has always done this. Every time the show resets after a catastrophic event, every time a season finale ends with the town on the edge of something that should permanently change everything, and the next season begins as if nothing unusual occurred. Every time a disaster is survived and immediately forgotten, every time a character is revealed to have a secret that should alter how every other character relates to them and is instead filed away by the narrative without consequence, every one of those moments is Springfield voting to maintain the agreed-upon version of reality. The Principal and the Pauper is the one episode where the show let you watch the vote happen in real time. The mechanism has always been there. It has always been operating. The episode just dropped the curtain and showed you the machinery. Consider what Springfield's history of forgetting actually looks like when you list it sequentially. The town was sealed under a federal dome because it was classified as an environmental hazard. The dome was removed. Nobody mentions it. The town was invaded by multiple supernatural entities in various Halloween specials that the show occasionally allows to bleed into canonical territory. Nobody discusses these events. Homer has been on the national news multiple times. He has been the subject of federal investigations. He has been publicly embarrassing in ways that should follow him permanently. Each of these things ends and the next episode begins without reference to the previous one. Marge has worked as a police officer, a real estate agent, a nuclear power plant employee, an artist, a restaurateur, a beer brewer, and a stay-at-home mother, sometimes in apparent simultaneity. The job history is never reconciled. Springfield Elementary has had its funding gutted, restored, reformed, and left in crisis multiple times. The state of the school's resources depends on what the current episode needs it to be. Every single one of these examples is Springfield's collective amnesia operating without being identified. The town forgets because the town has decided to forget. It is not that the residents have short memories. It is that short memory is the social contract. You remember only what you are permitted to remember. You discuss only what it is safe to discuss. Anything that does not serve the agreed-upon version of Springfield's reality is quietly moved to a category that is functionally indistinguishable from non-occurrence. The Principal and the Pauper makes this explicit by showing you the agreement itself. The vote, the legal decree, the physical removal of the inconvenient truth from the community that does not want to accommodate it. It is not poor writing. It is the show's most honest episode, and it connects to the radiation theory and the coma theory in ways that make it more significant than it first appears. If the radiation theory is true, if Springfield's population has been neurologically compromised by decades of contaminated water and air, then the collective amnesia is a symptom of that contamination. The damage to the population's cognitive function makes it easier for the forgetting to happen because the capacity for sustained critical engagement with uncomfortable information has been reduced across the entire population by the same exposure. Burns benefits from this. A population that is neurologically predisposed to forget is easier to manage than one that retains and builds on information about past events. If the residents of Springfield could hold onto the memory of every unsafe practice at the plant, every environmental violation, every time the contamination made itself visible in the form of three-eyed fish or glowing billionaires, the accumulation would eventually produce accountability. The contamination prevents this accumulation by damaging the neural architecture that makes memory retention possible. If the coma theory is true, the collective forgetting is even more fundamental than a neurological symptom. It is a property of the dreaming mind itself. Dreams do not maintain continuity between cycles. When you wake from one dream and fall into another, the previous dream does not inform the new one in the way that real experiences inform each other. They are separate, contained. The reset between episodes is the reset between dream cycles. Homer's brain, generating Springfield overnight after overnight after overnight, starts each new dream from a baseline, rather than accumulating the events of all previous dreams into a coherent, ongoing narrative. Springfield forgets because dreaming brains forget. It is not a choice. It is the architecture of unconscious thought. But the principle and the pauper offers a third possibility, one that does not require mutation or unconsciousness. It suggests that the forgetting is a choice, that the residents of Springfield are not incapable of remembering. They choose not to. They have constructed a social reality in which forgetting is the norm, because the alternative, remembering, confronting, accumulating, connecting the dots that lead from the three-eyed fish to the cracked cooling towers to the skeletons in the basement, is too destabilizing to allow. If Springfield remembered everything, it would have to confront the power plant. Confronting the power plant would mean challenging Burns. Challenging Burns would mean challenging the entire economic structure of the town. And the town's economic structure, whatever its flaws, is the reason Springfield has electricity and jobs and a school and a hospital and a quickie mart. Tear down Burns and you tear down the infrastructure that makes Springfield function. So the town does not remember, not because it cannot, but because remembering costs too much. The social contract requires forgetting. The economy requires forgetting. And the legal system, as the Tamzarian episode makes explicit, can be deployed to enforce forgetting when the informal social contract is not sufficient. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's canary in the mine. He was a man who showed up with incontrovertible proof that the official narrative was wrong. He did not threaten anyone. He did not make demands. He simply existed, which was itself an intolerable disruption to the agreed-upon version of reality. And Springfield's response was not to thank him for the information. It was to remove him physically from the community and make it illegal for anyone to acknowledge that he had been there. That is not a comedy beat. It is barely even satire. It is a description of how real communities deal with inconvenient truths. The mechanism Springfield uses is theatrical and exaggerated, tied to a railroad car and expelled by judicial decree. But the underlying dynamic, the community protecting its agreed-upon reality by removing the information that threatens it, is not fictional. It happens in real places to real people with less dramatic but equally effective methods. Springfield is, in this reading, not a parody of a small American town. It is an accurate portrait of one, rendered in yellow and four fingers, and with the volume turned up to the point where the mechanism is visible. The Tamzarian incident is not a blot on the show's history. It is the show's clearest statement about what Springfield is. A community that has decided, collectively, definitively, and with the force of legal enforcement behind it, that the truth is subordinate to the story they have chosen to tell about themselves. Armin Tamzarian is still pretending to be Seymour Skinner. The town is still pretending to believe him. And somewhere, tied to a railroad car in the official version of events, the last honest man in Springfield is still out there. Section 9. The predictions? Did The Simpsons see the future? In the year 2000, The Simpsons aired an episode in which a fictional future version of Springfield was visited by a grown Lisa Simpson. In that future, Lisa has become President of the United States. She is dealing, in the episode's brief economic joke, with the financial consequences of the administration that preceded hers. And the previous president, the one who left the country in the condition Lisa is inheriting, is identified by name, Donald Trump. 16 years later, Donald Trump won the 2016 presidential election. The internet response to this was overwhelming. Screenshots from the episode flooded social media platforms. Articles were written. The clip went viral among people who had not watched the show in years and among people who had never watched it at all. The Simpsons predicted Trump. The phrase became a cultural shorthand for something that felt at once obviously satirical and genuinely uncanny. And this was not a singular occurrence. The list of things the show appears to have predicted, assembled by fans over years of careful attention to the show's archive, is extensive enough to have generated its own documentary footage and its own corner of the internet dedicated to tracking and cataloging new editions. The show depicted something closely resembling a modern smartwatch in 1995, well before wearable computing technology had developed to the point where such a device was commercially available. Homer went to space in 1994 with Buzz Aldrin, decades before commercial space tourism became a real industry with real civilian passengers. A 1,998 episode contains a mathematical equation that a physicist later identified as an approximation of the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which was not experimentally confirmed until 2012. A 1,999 episode proposed a donut-shaped universe that cosmologists would later find some observational support for in their data about the universe's geometry. In 1993, an episode called Marge and Chains depicted a flu virus originating in Asia spreading to Springfield, causing panic buying, supply chain disruption, and a frantic search for a cure. The episode aired 27 years before a real respiratory virus originating in Asia caused exactly those things on a global scale. During the chaos of the fictional outbreak, the town accidentally releases a swarm of killer bees. The murder hornet scare of 2020, when Asian giant hornets appeared in the United States during the real pandemic, felt to many viewers like the show had done the joke first. In 1996, an episode called Homerpalooza featured, as a throwaway gag, the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra while in an altered state. In 2024, 28 years after the episode aired, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. In 1998, the show depicted the Disney Corporation acquiring 20th Century Fox. That acquisition happened in 2019. Across multiple episodes over multiple decades, the show depicted video calling, technology, autocorrect failures, and surveillance culture long before any of these things had penetrated daily life in the way they eventually did. The question the internet asks every time a new example surfaces is, how? Are the writers time travelers? Is there a conspiracy? Is the show somehow tapping into information about the future through a mechanism that current understanding cannot explain? The people who actually make the show have a simpler answer. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer on The Simpsons since its early seasons, addressed the prediction phenomenon directly, and his explanation was blunt. When you throw enough darts, you hit some bullseyes. That was his framing. The show has produced nearly 800 episodes over more than 3 decades. Each episode contains dozens of jokes and observations and satirical references to American culture and technology and politics, and when you generate that much content over that long a period, statistical probability alone ensures that some of it will align with future events. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its peak seasons, was even more direct. Most of what people call predictions are coincidences, enabled by the enormous volume of content the show has produced, and by the cyclical nature of history. Things happen, then similar things happen again. If you have enough material that made jokes about the first occurrence, some of that material will appear relevant when the second occurrence arrives. Fact-checking organizations have systematically worked through the most popular claimed predictions and found in most cases that the evidence for genuine forecasting is considerably weaker than the viral framing suggests. Many of the supposed predictions are extrapolations from trends that were already visible when the episodes were written, not predictions at all, but observations about the present moment presented as speculations about the future. The Trump prediction is the clearest example of this. Trump had been publicly discussing the possibility of running for president since at least the late 1980s. He had made multiple overtures toward political campaigns over the decades between those first public flirtations and the 2016 run. The joke in the 2000 episode was not a prediction about something that no one could have anticipated. It was a joke about a trajectory that was already in motion, pushed to its logical extreme for comic effect. If you had asked political observers in 2000 whether Trump would ever actually run, many would have said it was entirely possible. The Simpsons writers were not seeing the future. They were reading the present more carefully than most. The Disney-Fox merger prediction follows the same logic. Media consolidation was an accelerating trend throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Major corporations were absorbing their competitors at an increasing rate. The 1998 joke about Disney swallowing Fox was not a vision of a specific future event. It was a satirical comment on a pattern that was already visible and that the writers correctly anticipated would continue. The smartwatch example depends on how literally you interpret the resemblance between the device in the episode and actual smartwatch technology. The concept of a wrist-mounted computer or communication device has appeared in science fiction since at least the 1930s. The Simpsons version of it was drawing on a long tradition of imagined technology, not predicting the specific form that technology would eventually take. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been one of the most educated in American television. Multiple writers hold degrees from elite universities, with significant concentrations from Harvard and Yale. Many have backgrounds in mathematics, science, political theory, and economics. These are people who spend their professional lives studying patterns in American culture and politics and pushing those patterns to their absurd but logical conclusions. They are not guessing. They are applying rigorous analytical intelligence to trends that are already in motion. But here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Because the debunking, thorough and correct as it is, does not entirely resolve the phenomenon. Some of the coincidences are specific enough that the volume explanation feels insufficient. The episode about Siegfried and Roy, the famous Las Vegas magicians who worked with white tigers, depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers. The attack happened in a way that visually and thematically resembled the real incident in 2003 when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's tigers. The coincidence is not vague. It is not a general observation about the dangers of working with exotic animals. It is a specific scenario that matches a specific event with enough precision to produce genuine unease. The Trump escalator moment, in which the fictional future showed Trump descending dramatically in a way that echoes the famous escalator descent at the announcement of his 2015 campaign, is another example where the specificity goes beyond what trend extrapolation alone explains. These may still be coincidences. The volume argument is real, and it does not require every coincidence to be explainable individually, only that the overall hit rate is consistent with what probability would predict given the number of tries. And the number of tries, across nearly 800 episodes, is very large. But there is a theory about the predictions that is more interesting than any explanation involving either supernatural forecasting or pure coincidence. It is the theory that The Simpsons does not predict the future. It shapes it. Not through magic, not through prophecy, through cultural influence of a kind and scale that very few pieces of media in history have achieved. The Simpsons has been part of the American cultural conversation for longer than most of its audience has been alive. Its jokes have become part of the vocabulary through which Americans understand their own culture. Its observations have become reference points that people carry without necessarily remembering where they came from. The show has been absorbed into the background radiation of American life in a way that makes it difficult to identify as a distinct influence because it is everywhere. When the show made a joke about Trump becoming president in 2000, that joke entered the cultural bloodstream of everyone who watched it. 16 years is a long time, but the joke persisted. It was shared, referenced, remembered. It became part of how people thought about Trump as a political figure, part of the imaginative landscape that surrounded his eventual candidacy. The joke did not predict his presidency. The joke made his presidency feel familiar when it arrived. It primed the cultural imagination so that the event, when it occurred, felt like recognition rather than shock. This is the meta-theory. The Simpsons does not see the future coming. The Simpsons shapes the future by deciding which possibilities feel plausible to the culture in advance. It normalizes trends by depicting them as accomplished facts before they happen. And when the facts eventually materialize, the audience experiences them through the lens of having already been prepared. The show held up a mirror for 36 years, and America has been staring into it long enough that the image in the mirror and the face looking into it have begun to resemble each other. Springfield is not a prediction of where America was headed. Springfield is a diagnosis of where America already was. The nuclear power plant run by an indifferent billionaire whose violations are covered up by an incompetent inspector whose employment was guaranteed by a backroom deal with an old man who owed a debt. The corrupt politician. The media that covers everything and understands nothing. The population that watches everything and changes nothing. The town that riots over small things and accepts large ones. That is not a vision of a future America. That is a portrait of an America that existed when the show began and has continued to exist in various configurations ever since. And here is the final element of the prediction phenomenon that is worth considering. The show has also made jokes that did not come true, thousands of them. Jokes about technologies that never developed, political outcomes that went another way, cultural shifts that failed to materialize, future scenarios that the real future simply did not match. Nobody shares these. Nobody assembles viral lists of Simpsons predictions that turned out to be wrong. Confirmation bias operates in one direction. It selects for the hits and discards the misses. When you take 800 episodes containing thousands of satirical observations about the trajectory of American life and filter that content through the most powerful confirmation bias engine in history, which is the modern internet's capacity for viral circulation, you generate a highlight reel that looks like prophecy. The predictions that failed were filed away. The predictions that succeeded were shared, cited, framed as evidence. The result looks like a show with supernatural foresight. The reality is a brilliantly written show with an enormous archive of material, staffed throughout its history by some of the most intellectually capable writers working in television, making intelligent observations about patterns in American culture with enough consistency and volume that some of those observations were bound to look prophetic in retrospect. The show did not see the future. It wrote so many possible futures that some of them were bound to arrive, and the ones that did are the ones anyone remembers. Section 10. The people Springfield forgot Hans Moleman, Ned Flanders, and the hidden tragedies. There is a man in Springfield who keeps dying. His name is Hans Moleman. He is small. He is elderly in appearance. He is nearly blind, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses that suggest profound visual impairment. He moves through the background of Springfield with the particular wariness of someone who has learned, through extensive personal experience, that the world is structurally opposed to his continued existence. He gets hit by cars. He is crushed by objects. He is buried alive. He is struck by lightning. He falls into things. He walks into things. He is incinerated, drowned, attacked by animals, dropped from heights, and subjected to forms of misfortune that range from comic to genuinely disturbing when you think about them for more than a moment. He has died in canonical episodes of the show, in regular narrative context, not in dream sequences or Halloween specials, more times than any reasonable count can track. And then he shows up again, fully restored, no explanation, no resurrection scene, no acknowledgement that he was dead in the previous episode. He is simply there, in the background of the next scene, alive and approximately ambulatory, ready to absorb whatever the next episode has in store for him. The show treats this as background noise. Moleman dies. Moleman is back. This is the texture of Springfield. But Moleman himself provided, in a single throwaway line, a detail that makes his situation significantly stranger than a running gag. He once stated his age as 31 years old. Look at him. By every visual indicator the show provides, Moleman appears to be in his 80s or 90s. His physical form is that of an extremely elderly man. His skin, his posture, his apparent physical condition, everything about how he is drawn suggests a man who has been alive for a very long time. Yet he says he is 31. If he is telling the truth, which there is no in-universe reason to doubt, something happened to him. Something took a man in what should be the prime of his life and aged him catastrophically beyond anything natural. Something produced in a 31-year-old man the physical appearance of someone 50 or 60 years older. Something that also, apparently, makes him nearly indestructible despite his apparent frailty. The radiation theory has a specific application here. If Springfield's contamination can produce a three-eyed fish, if it can give Homer superhuman resilience to physical damage, if it can extend Burns's lifespan through mechanisms that involve controlled nuclear exposure, It may be capable of producing much more dramatic mutations in individuals who have a particular biological vulnerability to its effects. Molman may be someone whose specific biology responded to Springfield's contaminated environment in a way that accelerated his physical aging while simultaneously altering his cellular structure in ways that prevent conventional death from finalizing. He ages at an extraordinary rate. He dies at an ordinary rate. But he does not stay dead, because whatever the radiation has done to his biology has made death, for him, a temporary condition. His body reconstitutes. It resets. It returns from the edge because the mutation that is destroying him faster than any natural process would is also rebuilding him faster than any natural process would. He is, in this reading, the most extreme mutation in Springfield. The contamination has not just modified him. It has broken his relationship with mortality in a way that makes him the show's most visible, most consistently ignored piece of evidence that what is happening in Springfield is something for which normal frames of reference are insufficient. The coma theory offers a different reading. Mole Man is a background character. He populates the margins of Homer's dream, providing texture and familiar specificity to the world Homer's unconscious mind constructs. He is not central to any of Homer's most significant memories or relationships. He is peripheral, present but not deeply encoded. And peripheral characters in dreams behave differently than central ones. They flicker. They are less consistently maintained. The dreaming mind expends its coherence on the things that matter most to the dreamer, and the things that matter least are rendered with less attention, less continuity, less persistent existence. Molman dies because Homer's dreaming brain occasionally lets him lapse, a minor character whose continued existence is not being actively maintained by any strong emotional investment. And he returns because the dream needs him to populate the next scene, and the brain regenerates him from whatever fragment of his presence remains encoded in Homer's memories. Under this reading, Molman is not a person in the dream. He is a prop, a piece of furniture, a recurring image that the dream uses when it needs to demonstrate that Springfield is a populated town. He does not have continuity between episodes because he does not have the kind of significance in Homer's memory that would grant him continuity. There is something quietly devastating about this reading if you allow yourself to sit with it. A man who exists at the periphery of a dream, dying and returning, without anyone noticing, and without the experience of either death or return appearing to register as remarkable. He is less real in the dream than the main characters, which means he is the most expendable presence in a world where everyone's existence is already conditional on a dreamer's willingness to keep imagining them. Now let's turn to the character who occupies the exact opposite position in Springfield's moral landscape from Burns, and who is, in his own way, the saddest person in town, Ned Flanders. Ned is everything Homer is not, and the show has always used this contrast as a structural device. Homer is impulsive, self-destructive, intellectually limited, and held together by luck and the love of a family he barely deserves. Ned is disciplined, generous, devoutly faithful, physically fit, financially responsible, a patient father, and a supportive neighbor. He is, by any objective measure of character, a significantly better human being than Homer Simpson, and Springfield punishes him for it. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in a single confrontation or a single episode. Quietly, persistently, across decades. Ned Flanders receives his punishments the way weather receives things, without resistance, without complaint, with the particular grace of someone who has decided that suffering is the condition of existence and that the correct response to it is patience. His wife, Maud, was killed at the Springfield Speedway. The death was the result of a T-shirt cannon malfunction. The specific mechanics involve Homer dodging the T-shirts that were being launched at the crowd, which meant the T-shirts that would have hit Homer instead hit Maud, who was seated near him, and knocked her from the bleachers. Homer's selfishness, his specific physical act of moving out of the way of something aimed at him, killed Ned's wife. Ned forgave him. This is the thing that makes Ned's situation most difficult to look at directly. He did not just forgive a neighbor for a thoughtless act. He forgave the man whose movement caused the death of the person he loved most, in a moment that should have produced the kind of rage that changes a person permanently. He forgave it. He processed it through whatever internal mechanism he uses to process the gap between what the world does to him and what his faith tells him the world should be. And he stayed. He stayed next door to Homer. He continued being Homer's neighbor and friend. He continued being generous and available and patient in ways that Homer does not return and does not appear to fully appreciate. The show revealed why Ned is this way in an episode that is one of the most psychologically illuminating things The Simpsons has produced. In it, Ned has a complete psychological breakdown. The precipitating event is the destruction of his house by a hurricane and the community's subsequent effort to rebuild it, an effort so incompetent that the rebuilt house collapses immediately. In the aftermath, Ned snaps. He says things he has never said. He insults people. He articulates grievances that have apparently been accumulating for years. He is committed to a mental health facility. And in the facility, the backstory of his personality is revealed. Ned was a violent, uncontrollable child. His parents, who were beatniks of the 1960s variety and therefore philosophically opposed to discipline of any kind, could not manage him. They sought professional help. A psychiatrist spent years conditioning the aggression out of Ned through behavioral modification techniques that the show depicts as thorough and lasting. Ned's kindness, his patience, his relentless positivity, none of it is natural. It is the product of psychological programming. It is the cage a professional built around the violent, uncontrollable person Ned actually is, using the tools of behavioral therapy to reshape a personality from the inside. Ned's forgiveness of Homer is not grace. It is the conditioned response of a brain that was rewired in childhood to suppress anger at all costs. His faith is not spiritual conviction. It is the framework that a man constructed to explain why he keeps suffering, despite doing everything right, in a world that does not provide explanations for suffering unless you have a framework for interpreting it. His patience with Homer is not saintliness, it is pathology. The rage that Ned is not allowed to express by the conditioning of his childhood is still there, somewhere beneath the surface of the person he was programmed to be. The hurricane episode shows you what happens when the conditioning temporarily fails. The despair that emerges is not the despair of someone who has faced a bad moment. It is the despair of someone who has been performing okayness for decades, while something far less okay accumulated beneath the performance. The show knows all of this. It has shown it to us. And it has also shown us one more thing about Ned that makes his situation as stark as anything in the show's mythology. God talks to Homer. This is established canon. Homer has had multiple direct conversations with God, including the episode in which God tells Homer his time is coming. Homer, who regularly skips church, who falls asleep in the pew when he does attend, who approaches faith with the same breezy inattentiveness he brings to everything else, has been granted direct divine communication on multiple occasions. God has never spoken to Ned. Ned Flanders, who has devoted his life to faith with a depth and a consistency and a sincerity that Homer could not sustain for 5 minutes, who reads scripture and attends services and structures his entire existence around a relationship with God, has never received any form of direct response. The man who is trying gets silence. The man who is not trying gets conversation. This is not incidental. The Simpsons has always been a show aware of what it is saying, and this contrast is too precise to be accidental. The show is making a statement about how its universe distributes divine attention, and the statement is uncomfortable. Goodness is not rewarded in Springfield. Faith is not answered in Springfield. The system, whether you interpret that system as Burns's contamination, or Homer's dream, or Springfield's collective denial, or simply the show's own internal moral logic, does not care about righteousness. It cares about something else. Compliance, maybe. Proximity to power, luck. The willingness to not look at things too carefully. Homer is rewarded, constantly and extravagantly, by a universe that should by any reasonable standard have finished with him long ago. He survives things he should not survive. He gets things he has not earned. He is forgiven for things he has not apologized for. The universe of the show returns him, episode after episode, to a position of warmth and comfort and family connection that the narrative logic of any other story would have long since removed him from. Ned works for everything he has. He maintains himself with discipline and effort. He suffers losses that Homer caused and forgives them. He keeps faith with a practice that has never spoken back to him. He is, in every measurable way, the better person. And the show does not reward him. It is not a failure of the writing. It is the point. Ned Flanders is what happens when you do everything right in a system that has not been designed to reward rightness. He is the show's most honest character, in the sense that his suffering is the most direct acknowledgement that the world depicted in Springfield does not operate on merit. It operates on power, on accident, on the random distribution of grace that a universe built by one man's unconscious mind, or shaped by radiation, or governed by collective denial, provides without any particular relationship to what individuals deserve. Homer and Ned have lived next door to each other for 36 years. The gap between them, in terms of character, in terms of choices made and effort applied and losses suffered with dignity, has never closed. It has never even narrowed. The system does not close gaps. The system maintains them. Ned will keep forgiving. Homer will keep being forgiven. Burns will keep being sustained by the infrastructure he built. Molman will keep dying and returning. The plant will keep leaking. The fish will keep growing their third eyes. And nobody in Springfield will ever ask why. Because asking is not what Springfield does. Springfield accepts. It has been accepting for 36 years. And it will keep accepting as long as the loop keeps turning and the dream keeps running and the lights stay on in the town that refuses to look at itself. Section 11. The geography of impossibility. Where is Springfield? Springfield has a nuclear power plant, a tire fire, a gorge, a harbor, a monorail, an elementary school, a prison, a hospital, a retirement castle, a museum, a stadium, and a quick E-Mart. It also has mountains, and oceans, and desert, and farmland, and forest, and sometimes what appears to be a Canadian border in the near vicinity, and at other times what appears to be a proximity to Mexico that makes the mountains and the Canadian border mathematically impossible within any consistent map of the United States. Springfield's weather ranges from severe winter blizzards to tropical heat waves within the span of a single narrative season, and the show has never suggested that any of this is unusual or worthy of comment from the characters who live in it. The state in which Springfield is located has been implied, suggested, hinted at, briefly confirmed, and then contradicted by enough episodes over enough years that the answer to the question of which state it occupies depends entirely on which episode you happen to be watching when you ask. The show has placed Springfield in geographic proximity to Ohio, and Nevada, and Maine, and Kentucky. It has given characters area codes associated with Missouri. It has used a state abbreviation, NT, that does not correspond to any actual American state. Matt Groening, the show's creator, addressed the question directly in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine. He said he named the town after Springfield, Oregon, the city near where he grew up. The mystery, which had been a beloved piece of Simpsons mythology for over 2 decades at that point, was apparently solved. Springfield was in Oregon. For approximately 48 hours, fans processed this information. And then the show continued to air episodes that placed Springfield in geographic contexts fundamentally inconsistent with Oregon. The writers did not honor Groening's disclosure. The contradiction between the creator's statement and the show's own content was noted, discussed, and ultimately left unresolved because the show's writers understood something about the Springfield geography question that the creator's interview answer had temporarily obscured. The mystery is not a mistake that needed correcting. The mystery is the point. Springfield's geographic impossibility is a deliberate, sustained, carefully maintained element of the show's construction. It is not an oversight that accumulated over 3 decades of writing. It is a choice that was made at the beginning and has been renewed, episode by episode, for 36 years. The surface explanation for this is well understood, and the writers themselves have articulated it. Springfield is designed to be everywhere so that it can belong to everyone. Every viewer, regardless of their actual geographic location, should be able to recognize Springfield as their town. The mountains and the oceans and the desert and the farmland and the forest and the harbor and the blizzards and the heat waves, they are not a single place. They are every place. They are a composite of every American landscape stitched together into a single impossible geography that contains a piece of every viewer's experience of what an American town looks like. This is the intentional design philosophy, and it works. Springfield feels familiar to people who grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and to people who grew up in the Southeast, and to people who grew up in the Midwest, and to people who grew up in New England. Because Springfield borrowed something from each of those places and assembled those borrowings into a geography that is less a specific location than a concept. An idea of an American town that is more archetypal than geographical. But the theories we have been exploring across this entire discussion offer additional readings of the geographic impossibility that go beyond design philosophy. Under the coma theory, Springfield's geography makes a particular kind of sense. Homer's unconscious mind does not have a precise, cartographically accurate map of the United States encoded in its memory. What it has is a collection of impressions, feelings, visual fragments, and emotional associations gathered from everywhere Homer has ever been or seen or heard about. A mountain range glimpsed on a family vacation, an ocean seen in a movie or from an airplane window, desert that appeared in a television program watched through half-closed eyes at the end of a long day, farmland visible from the window of a car during a drive to somewhere else. Homer's brain assembles Springfield from these fragments without regard for whether they are geographically compatible, because geographic compatibility is not a criterion that dreaming minds apply to the worlds they construct. Dreams are built from feeling, from association, from the emotional significance of images rather than their spatial relationships to each other. Springfield has mountains and oceans and deserts simultaneously because Homer's memory contains all of these things and has no mechanism for sorting them into geographically coherent order. The town is everywhere Homer has ever been, layered over each other in the particular impossible way that dreams layer images. Under the radiation theory, the geographic question becomes even stranger and more specific. If the contamination from the plant has been dramatic enough to alter the biology of every organism in the town, producing mutations that range from extra eyes to four-fingered hands to changed pigmentation to possibly altered aging processes, there is no particular reason to assume that the contamination's effects are limited to biology. Radiation, at the scales implied by the evidence visible in Springfield, could theoretically affect more than living organisms. It could affect the physical environment around it. What if Springfield's geography is impossible because the radiation has done something to the space around the plant that collapses geographic distance in ways that normal physics does not allow? The mountains that should be hundreds of miles from the ocean are not hundreds of miles away because the contamination has warped the physical landscape around Springfield in the same way that it has warped the physical form of the people living in it. This is science fiction of a fairly radical kind. It is the theory pushed to its extreme, past the point where it maintains any connection to conventional frameworks of radiation physics. But the show is a cartoon. It has never committed to operating within conventional physics. And if you are willing to follow the mutation theory to its logical endpoint without imposing a ceiling on how far you allow it to extend, the geographic impossibility of Springfield is not a separate phenomenon from the biological impossibility of its residents. It is the same phenomenon applied to a larger scale. The radiation does not just mutate people, it mutates the landscape. Springfield is impossible because everything within the contamination zone has been altered by decades of radioactive leaking, and the alteration extends to the physical geography of the place itself. Under the collective denial theory introduced by the principal and the pauper, Springfield's geographic ambiguity serves a specific and deeply practical function. You cannot investigate a town, you cannot locate. Federal regulatory agencies have jurisdiction defined by geography. The EPA operates within specific state and regional structures. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has its authority organized around the states in which facilities are licensed. If the state in which Springfield's power plant operates is genuinely uncertain, if the jurisdiction keeps shifting depending on which episode you're looking at, then the regulatory machinery that should be overseeing the plant is perpetually uncertain about whether it has authority to act. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. A fixed geographic location means a fixed regulatory environment means fixed oversight means fixed accountability. A geographic location that mutates between episodes means that no single regulatory body ever has clear, uncontested authority over the plant, the town, or the contamination. Burns does not need to bribe every EPA regional office in the country if the question of which regional office has jurisdiction is perpetually unresolved. He does not need to manage every state attorney general if no state can confidently claim Springfield as its own. The geographic ambiguity is not a narrative convenience. It is a legal strategy. The town that cannot be found cannot be investigated. The contamination that has no fixed jurisdiction cannot be remediated by any single authority. The billionaire whose plant cannot be definitively placed within any particular state's regulatory framework cannot be held to any particular state's standards. Springfield does not appear on any map, and as long as it does not appear on any map, it exists outside the normal structures of accountability that maps define. The show gave away the location once. In the episode Behind the Laughter, a mockumentary that depicted the Simpsons as a real family who had become the basis for a fictional television show, the episode stated that the family was from northern Kentucky. This was the answer, definitively. On screen. And then, when the episode went into syndication and began to air in different markets, the location was changed. The syndicated version identified a different state. The answer that the show had given was revised. The definitive answer was made indefinite by the act of rebroadcast. Even when Springfield has a location, the location does not stay fixed. This is the final and most fundamental expression of Springfield's relationship with truth. The town that collectively voted to make honesty illegal, that tied the last honest man to a railroad car and expelled him, that has maintained a false version of its principal's identity for decades through judicial decree, cannot even commit to a consistent location on a map. Truth is dangerous in Springfield. Geography is truth. And Springfield protects itself from the consequences of geographic truth the way it protects itself from every other inconvenient form of it, by ensuring that no single version of it ever becomes stable enough to act on. Springfield is everywhere. Springfield is nowhere. And as long as it stays nowhere, it cannot be held responsible for anything that happens inside it. Section 12. The loop that never breaks. Everything comes back to the couch. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight. We have walked through the radiation in the water and the mutations in the residents and the cracked cooling towers that leak their invisible output into the lives of people who cannot fully process what is being done to them. We have sat with the idea of a man dreaming in a hospital bed, his family frozen at the last age he knew them, his world growing stranger and more elaborate as his brain generates increasingly desperate simulations of a life it cannot reach. We have reopened the shooting case and found that the official answer does not hold up under sustained examination, and that the alternative answers are more interesting and perhaps more true. We have traced the survival mechanisms of the oldest man in Springfield and found that his immortality is not magic, but engineering, the product of a century of deliberate, resourced effort aimed at a single outcome. We have looked behind Maggie's silence and found something remarkable there, an intelligence that has chosen invisibility as its strategy and has sustained that strategy with a discipline that most adults could not maintain for a week, let alone 36 years. We have followed Mona Simpson's trail from a kitchen in Springfield in 1969 to a cemetery reunion with a son who barely knew she was alive, and we have traced the wreckage that Burns's response to her activism left across 3 generations of a family that should not have had to carry it. We have watched the town collectively vote to expel truth and criminalize its memory, and we have recognized in that vote something that is not specific to Springfield, but is present in real communities whenever the cost of honesty exceeds what the community is willing to pay. We have tried to find Springfield on a map, and found instead that the town exists in a state of permanent geographic ambiguity that serves the interests of the people who benefit most from it being unfindable. And now, at the end of it, we are back where we started. The couch, the family, the credits rolling in the same sequence they have rolled in for 36 years. Bart running to the television, Lisa riding her bicycle, Marge driving, Homer coming home from work, almost missing the family as they settle into their seats, joining them at the last possible moment. This is the ritual. This is the thing the show does, and the thing its audience does in response every single time. The world outside might be in any state of crisis or beauty or mundane complexity, but the couch is always there. The family is always there, the TV is on, the beer is cold, the house on Evergreen Terrace is as it has always been. Why does this matter to us? Why, after everything we have uncovered about what Springfield actually is, and what is actually happening to the people who live in it, do we keep coming back? The answers to that question are individual, and they are varied. and they are ultimately more interesting than any theory about radiation or comas or sundials pointing to initial guilt. But there are patterns in them. The Simpsons arrived in 1989 as a show about a specific kind of American family, not an idealized one. Not the families that television had generally offered its audiences before this show came along, functional and aspirational, and defined by their resemblance to a version of domestic life that most actual families did not fully recognize in themselves. The Simpson family was dysfunctional in ways that felt honest. Homer was incompetent in ways that felt familiar. Marge's patience was tested in ways that felt real. Bart's impulses were recognizable to anyone who had ever been 10 years old and unconvinced that the authority figures around them deserved their compliance. The show was funny because it was true, and the truth it was telling about the gap between the family we present to the world and the family we actually are resonated in a way that created something like loyalty in its audience. 36 years later, that loyalty has become something more complicated. The people who watched the earliest episodes were, in many cases, children. They are now middle-aged adults who have had children of their own, who have watched those children grow up and move out, who have done all of the things that The Simpsons have never done and never will do because the loop does not allow it. They have aged around the show the way rivers age around stone. The world moved. Springfield stayed still. And maybe that stillness is part of what the loyalty is about. As long as Bart is 10 years old, the time when you were 10 years old is not entirely gone. As long as Homer comes home from work and drops onto the couch and the TV comes on and the family gathers in that living room, the version of your own domestic life that felt comfortable and recognizable and safe is not entirely past. Springfield preserves not just its own characters and Amber, it preserves the emotional reality of the audience's earliest experience of the show. Every episode is a small act of retrieval. The show knows this. The writers have always known this. The floating timeline is not just a production convenience. It is a relationship management strategy. The Simpsons maintains its emotional connection to its audience by refusing to age, because aging would mean acknowledging that the audience has aged, and that acknowledgement would be the end of the particular kind of comfort the show provides. Homer's coma dream, if that is what the show since 1993 actually is, wants exactly this: a world that stays still, a family that does not change, children who remain children forever because the dreaming father cannot bear to imagine them otherwise. The emotional logic of the theory is inseparable from the emotional logic of the show's relationship with its audience. We are all, in some sense, dreaming alongside Homer. We are all maintaining a world that has already changed, keeping a family frozen in a moment that has passed, coming back week after week to a couch that may not exist in the same form it did when we first sat down on it. The loop is not Homer's prison, it is ours. We built it, we maintain it, we tune in every time to ensure it is still running, to confirm that the family is still intact, to reassure ourselves that the version of Springfield we first loved is still there waiting for us. And every theory we have explored tonight, every piece of evidence, every buried detail, every unresolved mystery, ultimately circles back to this. The reason we keep asking questions about Springfield is the same reason we keep watching. Not because the answers will satisfy us, not because any theory fully resolves the contradictions built into 36 years of storytelling, but because asking is how we stay in relationship with the show. The questions keep us engaged. The mysteries keep us returning. The impossibilities of Springfield generate the curiosity that generates the attention, that generates the loyalty that has kept this show on the air for 36 years when everything about the economics of television should have ended it 20 years ago. Springfield does not make sense. It has never made sense. The yellow skin and the four fingers and the ageless children and the billionaire who glows in the dark and the town that resets after every catastrophe and the man who keeps dying in the background and the baby who knows more than she will say and the principal who is not who he says he is and the mother who was alive when the show said she was dead. None of it is explained. None of it will be explained. The show is not building toward an answer. It is building the questions into the architecture because a show that can be solved is a show that can be finished, and Springfield cannot be finished. It can only be returned to, night after night, episode after episode, theory after theory. The loop turns, the credits roll. Bart races to the couch. Lisa arrives from another direction. Marge and Maggie emerge from the market. Homer barely makes it in time, sliding into his seat as the family settles. The television is on. Everyone is home. Everything is as it was. And out there, beyond the windows of the house on Evergreen Terrace, beyond the cracked cooling towers of the plant and the contaminated river where Blinky swims his three-eyed circuits, and the woods where a glowing old man wanders on Friday nights, beyond the map that cannot find Springfield and the jurisdiction that cannot hold it accountable, and the collective memory that has voted to forget everything that makes the town too uncomfortable to look at clearly. Out there, in a hospital room, there may be a man in a bed. His hand is on top of the covers. His breathing is regular, maintained by the machines that monitor it. His family, if they are still there, are sitting beside him in a room where a television plays through the night. On the television, a family is coming home. The credits roll. The loop continues. Homer always finds his way back, because in his dream he never left. That is Springfield. That is the mystery, in the end reduced to its most essential form. Not the radiation or the coma or the frozen clock or the unsolved shooting or the immortal billionaire or the silent genius or the missing mother or the town that cannot be located. The mystery is simpler than all of that. The mystery is why we love it. And the answer, when you get there, feels like coming home to a couch that has been waiting for you since 1989, in a house on a street in a town that does not appear on any map, where the family has been waiting in the same positions they were in when you left, where nothing has changed, where nothing ever changes, where the beer is cold and the television is on and the loop keeps turning, gently, in the dark. Good night. See you next time in Springfield. This script was written for voice narration. Approximate running time at standard audiobook pace, 4 hours, 15 minutes. Total word count, approximately 43,000 words. Section 13. The marriages that should have broken Homer and Marge, and the thing that holds. There is a question about Homer and Marge Simpson that the show has circled for 36 years without ever fully answering, and the question is simple enough that it should be answerable. Why are they still together? Not in the cynical sense. Not as an attack on the relationship or the characters. As a genuine inquiry into the nature of a partnership that has survived things that real partnerships do not typically survive, and that the show itself acknowledges should not have left things intact. Let's begin with an inventory, because the inventory is important. Homer has forgotten their anniversary multiple times. He has forgotten Marge's birthday. He has, in moments of spectacular insensitivity, failed to notice that she was unhappy, distressed, or in some form of need in ways that anyone paying the minimal amount of attention available to a conscious adult would have registered. He has, on multiple occasions, made decisions of significant consequence to the family, including financial decisions, career decisions, and social decisions, without consulting Marge or even informing her until the consequences had already materialized. He has embarrassed her publicly in ways that most people would find difficult to forgive. He has put the family in physical danger through his incompetence more times than any comprehensive list could contain. He has, through his employment at the nuclear plant, been the proximate cause of environmental contamination that has affected the children she has raised and the home she has maintained. He once accidentally contributed to the death of her bowling team's morale at a crucial tournament. He has prioritized donuts over meaningful engagement in situations where meaningful engagement was obviously required. And Marge has stayed, not because she is passive. Marge is not a passive character. She has strong opinions, strong values, and the capacity to act decisively when her family is threatened. She has taken jobs, pursued interests, challenged injustice, and demonstrated throughout the show's run that she is a person with an interior life rich enough to sustain her through 36 years of cohabitation with Homer Simpson. She has also, on at least one occasion, seriously considered whether the marriage was worth continuing. The show has depicted Marge at the edge of leaving. It has depicted her in relationships, emotional, if not entirely physical, with men who were attentive in ways Homer consistently is not. It has given her the opportunity, dramatized across multiple episodes, to choose a different life. She has not taken it. The fan theories about why are not as elaborately developed as the radiation theory or the coma theory, but they are present, and they are worth examining. The most straightforward reading, and the one the show itself seems to endorse in its more sentimental episodes, is that Marge loves Homer. Not the version of Homer that would emerge if you optimized him against a checklist of desirable partner qualities. The actual Homer. The Homer who falls down and gets up and says the wrong thing and means well, and loves his family with an uncomplicated, unreflective intensity that is, in its way, the thing that holds the household together. Homer's love for Marge is not sophisticated. It is not expressed through the kind of careful, articulate emotional intelligence that might distinguish it as a particularly evolved form of affection. It is expressed through persistence, through the fact that at the end of every episode, regardless of what catastrophe the plot has put them through, Homer comes home. He is there. He is present in the particular dumb, warm, persistent way that he is always present, and Marge, who has had decades to learn what persistent presence looks like when it is reliably provided, has decided that it is enough, more than enough. In some episodes, the show has depicted genuine tenderness between these two characters that transcends the comedy of their obvious incompatibility. Moments where Homer, without the benefit of intelligence or eloquence or any of the tools that conventional romantic expression requires, manages to reach Marge in a way that the more sophisticated men around her cannot. These moments are structurally important to the show because they are the moments that justify everything else. They are the evidence that what appears from the outside as an inexplicable partnership is, from the inside, something real. But the coma theory offers a reading of the Homer-Marge relationship that is darker and more interesting than the simple version of love as sufficient explanation. If Homer is dreaming, then the Marge of the dream is Homer's construction of Marge. She is not the actual Marge Bouvier Simpson, whatever that person has become in the years since April 1993. She is the Marge that Homer knew, rendered with whatever accuracy his unconscious mind can manage given the source material it is working from. And the dream Marge is constructed by a mind that loves the original with the particular intensity of someone who knows they are in danger of losing access to everything they love. The dream Marge is infinitely patient. She forgives things that the real Marge might not forgive because Homer's dreaming mind needs her to forgive them. She stays through things that might genuinely end a marriage because Homer's unconscious is generating a world where the marriage does not end, cannot end, because the loss of the marriage would be the loss of the thing the coma dream exists to protect. The dream is a preservation mechanism. Homer's deepest fear, the thing the coma took him closest to facing, is losing his family. So the dream does the one thing it can do for him. It ensures that the family is never lost. The marriage survives everything because in Homer's dream, it has to survive everything. The alternative is unthinkable. This reading of Marge's patience as a projected hope, rather than a character attribute, is not the only reading the show supports. But it is a reading that takes seriously the emotional core of what the coma theory actually claims. That the dream of Springfield is not primarily a dream about adventure or celebrity or impossible events. It is a dream about a family. And the marriage at the center of that family is the most important thing being preserved in the dream, the thing the entire simulation exists to protect from the only outcome Homer cannot face. There is also the question of what Marge knows. The show has suggested in various ways across various episodes that Marge has a more complete understanding of the family situation than she generally reveals. She is aware that Homer is not operating at full capacity. She has adjusted her expectations and her strategies accordingly, managing the household around his limitations rather than attempting to eliminate them, which would be both futile and damaging to the person she loves. She has, in moments of genuine pressure, demonstrated a strategic intelligence that Homer does not have access to. She makes plans. She anticipates consequences. She understands the dynamics of the social world around her and navigates them with a competence that the chaos of the household often obscures. Marge knows more than she shows. This is not sinister. It is the particular competence of someone who has been managing a complicated domestic situation for decades and has learned that showing everything you know is not always the most effective strategy for getting what you actually want. What does Marge want? The show has given several answers to this across its run. She wants the family to stay together. She wants her children to be healthy and educated and eventually capable of sustaining themselves in the world. She wants, in the particular way of someone who has suppressed her own ambitions so consistently that she has had to rediscover them multiple times, some form of creative or professional expression that is her own, separate from her role in the family. She wants Homer to be okay, not brilliant, not transformed. Okay, functioning, present, coming home. And in the dream, if that is what Springfield is, all of these things are given to her. Or rather, they are given to the version of her that Homer's mind constructs, the version that needs what Homer needs her to need in order for the dream to hold together. The marriage of Homer and Marge is, across all the possible readings of what Springfield is, the most fundamental thing. The thing that every other element of the show's mythology exists in relationship to. The radiation theory is partly a theory about what happened to a family that lived in a contaminated environment. The coma theory is a theory about a man trying to preserve his connection to a woman and a family he cannot physically reach. The shooting theory has Marge as a possible shooter motivated by the defense of the family Burns systematically threatened. Mona's story is a story about what happens when a family is broken by one person's power over another, and Homer's survival of that breaking is inseparable from Marge's presence in his life as the person who provided the stability that Mona's absence left empty. Marge is the foundation, not because she is passive or uncomplicated or merely a supportive presence enabling Homer's more dynamic storylines. Because she is the thing the show, in all its strangeness and impossibility, keeps coming back to as the source of the emotional stakes that make any of this matter. Homer can go to space and meet presidents and join secret societies and survive physical catastrophes that defy biology and logic and basic Newtonian physics. And all of it, every ridiculous, impossible adventure, is tethered to the question of whether he will come home. Whether the house on Evergreen Terrace will be there when the episode ends. Whether Marge will be at the kitchen counter and the kids will be somewhere in the house and the television will be on and everything will be as it should be. That is the loop. And Marge is its center. She stays because the show needs her to stay. She forgives because the show needs her to forgive. She sees Homer clearly and loves him anyway because the show, at its most fundamental level, is not a story about anything else. It is a story about a man who wants to go home and always, somehow, manages to get there, and the woman who keeps the light on, for 36 years, for as long as the dream runs. Section 14. The children Springfield produced Bart, Lisa, and the futures they will never reach. Bart Simpson has been 10 years old for 36 years. In that time, he has failed to age by a single day, failed to progress beyond the 4th grade, failed to outgrow the particular species of chaos he generates wherever he goes. He has also, across the same 36 years, demonstrated a complexity that the surface reading of him as the delinquent troublemaker misses almost entirely. Bart is not a bad kid. This is easy to lose in the noise of everything he does that is demonstrably wrong, all the pranks and the cheating and the spectacular failures of impulse control that define his outward behavior. But the show has returned repeatedly to a version of Bart that exists beneath the performance of delinquency, a version that is sensitive and loyal and capable of genuine ethical seriousness when the situation produces it. He feels guilt deeply. When his pranks cause real harm to people he cares about, the guilt is real and visible and not easily dismissed. He is loyal to the people who earn his loyalty with a consistency that exceeds what most adults manage. He has demonstrated in multiple episodes that require him to set aside the persona he wears for the world, a capacity for care and tenderness that the persona is designed to prevent anyone from expecting. The delinquent act is a performance. The show knows this. Some of the show's finest episodes exist precisely in the gap between who Bart performs being and who he actually is. The question the theories raise about Bart is a version of the question they raise about everyone in Springfield. What has been done to him, and by whom? And what might he have become without it? Under the radiation theory, Bart's behavior is at least partly a symptom of neurological damage. Impulse control, the capacity to delay gratification, the ability to predict the consequences of actions and choose the action with better long-term outcomes. These are functions of specific regions of the brain that are sensitive to the kinds of disruption that chronic radiation exposure produces. Bart's impulse control is minimal. His ability to predict consequences is selective. He can be surprisingly strategic when the goal matters enough, but his default operating mode is immediate action over considered response. This is consistent with what happens to developing brains in contaminated environments. Bart grew up in Springfield. He was raised in a house with water from the same contaminated source as everyone else, breathing the same air, living under the same cracked cooling towers. His brain, developing during childhood in that environment, was shaped by it in ways that were never corrected because no one in Springfield was diagnosing the environmental cause of the symptoms they were seeing. The show has also established directly that Bart has significant undiagnosed learning differences that the Springfield school system has consistently failed to address. He has been tested. He has been evaluated. The evaluations have been performed by Springfield medical and educational professionals operating within an institution that the contamination theory suggests may be systematically compromised in its ability to accurately diagnose what is wrong with the children of Springfield. The evaluations have produced diagnoses and prescribed interventions that have not helped, possibly because the actual cause of Bart's difficulties is not the cause being treated. Under the coma theory, Bart is the child Homer misses most. Not necessarily the one Homer loves most. The show is careful about this. Each child is loved specifically and in the way that child's character invites. But Bart is the one Homer's relationship with is most overtly expressed, most dramatically enacted, most regularly placed at the center of episodes. The strangling, which is clearly played as comedy and is not meant to be taken literally as a model of parental behavior, is paradoxically the show's most consistent expression of the emotional bond between them. It is immediate. It is physical. It is Homer's specific, characteristic response to Bart's existence, and it has been happening for 36 years. Homer's dream preserves Bart at 10 because that is the age Bart was when Homer went under. But it also preserves the dynamic, the relationship, the specific texture of what being Bart's father felt like at that moment. The pranks and the frustration and the exasperation and the deep, persistent, unconditional love underneath all of it. The dream does not just preserve the image of Bart, it preserves what Bart was to Homer. Lisa's situation is, in many ways, the most complicated. She is brilliant. This fact is so thoroughly established in the show's mythology that it is less a character trait than a given, the starting point from which every other element of her character develops. She is a genius. She knows she is a genius. She exists in an environment that is structurally hostile to what her genius represents, and she has been navigating that hostility since the show began, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has never been able to just stop being the smartest person in the room. Lisa's intelligence is not a comfortable thing. It is not a source of straightforward advantage. In Springfield, in a household with Homer, in a school where the resources are inadequate and the standards are low, and the adults are too consumed by their own dysfunction to give her the engagement she needs, her intelligence isolates her more than it empowers her. She knows things that the people around her do not know. She sees things that the people around her cannot see. She cares about things that the people around her will not care about. And she has spent 36 years trying to close the gap between the world as she can imagine it and the world as it actually is, with limited success and persistent effort. The radiation theory applied to Lisa suggests an interesting counterpoint to its application to Homer. If the contamination affects different residents in different ways, if it can reduce some people's cognitive function while potentially enhancing others, Lisa may represent a middle case that is more complicated than either Homer's diminishment or Maggie's extraordinary amplification. Lisa's intelligence is natural, or as natural as intelligence gets in a contaminated environment. It has not been suppressed, which may mean she was less vulnerable to the specific neurological effects of the contamination, or it may mean that her intelligence operates on a different substrate than the one the contamination primarily affects. But there are things about Lisa that are less natural than her intelligence. Her emotional isolation, her difficulty connecting with peers, her tendency to catastrophize and to experience the weight of the world's problems as a personal burden that she is uniquely responsible for addressing. These patterns, in a clinical context, would be worth examining as possible effects of environmental factors, including the kind of chronic environmental stress that comes from living in a contaminated area where the adults around you are operating at reduced cognitive capacity. Lisa has never had access to adults who are fully capable of meeting her where she is. Homer cannot sustain the engagement her intelligence requires. Marge provides warmth and stability that matters enormously, but the intellectual challenge that Lisa needs is not something Marge prioritizes in the way Lisa needs her to. The teachers at Springfield Elementary are, with the occasional magnificent exception, not equipped to nurture someone of Lisa's capacity, She has had to be, from a very young age, largely self-directed in her own intellectual development. This is the damage Springfield does to Lisa that is different from the damage it does to Homer, or to Bart, or to any of the other residents whose difficulties are more obviously biological. Lisa's damage is not primarily neurological, it is developmental. It is the consequence of being extraordinary in an environment that has no mechanism for nurturing the extraordinary, and of spending decades in that environment, without ever fully resolving the question of whether to stay and keep fighting or leave and build something different somewhere else. The show has imagined Lisa's future multiple times. Lisa's wedding, which we discussed in the first section, is the most developed of these glimpses. But across all the future episodes the show has produced, the common thread is that adult Lisa is still fighting. Still engaged in the same battles, at a higher level, with more resources and more platform, but still fundamentally the same person, still trying to close the gap between the world she can see and the world that exists. She never stopped. That is the most important thing about Lisa. In Springfield, where the social contract is built around stopping, around forgetting and accepting and letting things be what they are, Lisa never stopped. Bart, at 36 years old, if the years had been allowed to pass, would be a middle-aged man. 46 years old, to be precise. If you calculate from his age in 1989, he would have whatever the adult version of his trajectory produced. The show has imagined this too, in future episodes, and the versions of adult Bart that have appeared vary between bleak and redemptive, but tend towards something in between, a person who outgrew the worst of his impulses while remaining recognizably himself. Lisa, at 36 years old, would be 44. She might be a senator. She might be a scientist. She might be both. The show has pointed towards so many possible futures for her that they cannot all be right, but the consistent suggestion is that whatever she became it by force of will and intelligence applied without pause. But these futures will not happen. The loop does not allow them. The floating timeline holds Bart at 10 and Lisa at 8 and Maggie at 1, forever, in the amber of a family moment that feels to the audience like something between memory and wish. The futures are imagined and glimpsed and then put away, locked behind the door that the episode closes when it ends. Springfield produces children who are shaped by it, by the contamination in the air and the water, by the institutional failures that leave their specific needs unaddressed, by the social environment that rewards certain kinds of behavior and punishes others and produces in its young residents a complex of adaptations and compensations that will define them for as long as the loop keeps running. These are not simple children. The show has never been content with simple children. Bart is the kid the system has labeled a problem, who contains under that label a person worth knowing. Lisa is the kid the system has labeled a prodigy, who contains under that label a person paying a price that nobody is accounting for. Maggie is the kid the system has not labeled yet, who is operating below everyone's radar with an intelligence and a patience that will eventually demand an accounting. These are the children Springfield produced, and they are still producing them, every week, in the same house, on the same street, in the town that time forgot to leave. Section 15. The workers of Springfield: class, labor, and the economics of a contaminated town. There is a class system operating in Springfield. This is not immediately obvious from the show's surface. Springfield presents itself, in the way that most American settings present themselves, as a community where class distinctions are present but fluid, where economic circumstance is a matter of individual luck and effort rather than systemic structure. The show is set in the middle of the American middle class. In the particular version of it that involves a union job at an industrial facility, a house in a residential neighborhood, a reliable, if modest income, and the practical concerns that accompany that economic position. Homer is a union member. This is a significant detail that the show establishes clearly in its early seasons, when Homer's job at the power plant is understood partly through the lens of his membership in the International Brotherhood of Jazz Dancers, Pastry Chefs, and Nuclear Technicians. The union is a real presence in the show, providing not just job protection for Homer, but a community of fellow workers who share his economic position and his concerns. The nuclear power plant is the central economic institution of Springfield. It employs a significant percentage of the town's working population. It provides the electricity that every household and business in the town depends on. It generates the tax revenue that funds the town's public institutions, including the schools and the emergency services and the infrastructure that makes the rest of Springfield's civic life possible. Burns owns all of this. One man. One very old, very powerful, very deliberately insulated man owns the economic foundation of the entire community. His decisions determine whether the plant stays open. His priorities determine how the plant is operated. His values, which the show has established across dozens of episodes as essentially and comprehensively hostile to the well-being of anyone but himself, determine the conditions under which every person who works for him labors and every person who lives in the town exists. This is not a background detail. This is the defining economic fact of Springfield's existence. When Burns wants to reduce costs by cutting safety measures, there is no effective institutional check on that decision. The regulatory failures are documented in the plant's inspection record, which shows 342 violations that were never remediated because Burns refused to pay the cost of fixing them. The union provides some protection for individual workers, but it cannot force Burns to maintain the facility safely if he is determined not to. The local government is no check on Burns, because Burns's contribution to the local tax base makes him effectively untouchable by local political institutions. The federal government is, as the Dome episode makes clear, capable of identifying the problem, but capable also of producing responses that are catastrophic without being corrective. Springfield's class system has Burns at the absolute top, separated from everyone else by a wealth differential so extreme that it is barely a class distinction and more accurately described as a different category of existence. Below Burns, there is a thin layer of professional class Springfield residents, lawyers, doctors, teachers, business owners, who have enough economic security to maintain a stable life, but not enough to resist the town's fundamental dependence on the plant. And below them, the working class majority, people like Homer, who depend on the plant directly for their employment, and who depend on it indirectly for the economic activity it generates throughout the town. The contamination theory maps directly onto this economic structure. The people closest to the source of the contamination, the workers inside the plant itself, are the most exposed. Homer, who spends the majority of his working hours in direct proximity to an active reactor with 342 safety violations, is absorbing more radiation than any resident of Springfield who does not work inside the facility. The people who live in the neighborhoods closest to the plant receive a higher dose than those in neighborhoods further away. The contamination gradient follows the economic gradient, because the people with the least economic power to live elsewhere are the people who live closest to the plant, and the plant is where the contamination is most concentrated. This is not unique to Springfield. It is a documented pattern in the real world. Industrial facilities that contaminate their surrounding environment tend to be located in or adjacent to communities with lower economic resources, communities with less political power to resist siting decisions, and less capacity to relocate when the consequences become apparent. The people most exposed to industrial pollution are, disproportionately, the people least able to escape it. Springfield is a cartoon version of this pattern, but it is a recognizable version. The workers who spend the most time inside the plant bear the greatest biological cost of Burns's refusal to fix the violations. The residents who live downwind and downstream bear a secondary cost proportional to their proximity. The town's leadership, whose civic infrastructure depends on the revenue the plant generates, bears a political cost. The inability to challenge the plant's operation without destroying the economic foundation of the community they govern. And Burns, who lives far enough from the plant's direct contamination zone to be affected primarily by the controlled radiation of his weekly treatments, rather than the uncontrolled contamination of the facility's leaks, bears none of the costs and collects all of the profits. This is the economic structure of Springfield. One man, positioned at the top of a hierarchy built on a contaminated foundation, extracting the value produced by the labor and the health of an entire community while insulating himself from the consequences of the extraction. The show has never presented this as a political argument. It has presented it as a setting, as the background conditions within which the comedy unfolds. The class structure and the economic dynamics are ambient, part of the texture of Springfield rather than the subject of explicit analysis. But the texture is consistent. The economic reality of Springfield is precisely the economic reality that the contamination theory predicts. a community economically dependent on its own contamination source. Workers whose health is compromised by the conditions of their employment in ways they cannot effectively resist. A billionaire whose survival depends on managing his own exposure while everyone else absorbs the unmanaged version. The union, in this context, is simultaneously the most important institution in working Springfield and the most inadequate. Homer's job security, as we noted in the section on Mona Simpson, is not actually the product of union protection. It is the product of a backroom deal between Burns and Homer's father. The union provides the framework within which that deal operates, but the deal itself bypasses the union's mechanisms entirely. Homer is protected not by collective bargaining but by private arrangement, a reminder that in Springfield, the formal institutions of worker protection are always shadowed by informal structures that operate outside them and often supersede them. Bart's famous line, "Don't have a cow, man," is a piece of idiom that originated in youth culture. But there is a reading of it that applies to the class analysis of Springfield. Don't have a cow, man. Don't be alarmed. Don't make a scene. Don't react with the intensity that the situation might seem to warrant. Stay calm. Stay in your lane. Accept the conditions as they are. This is the advice that Springfield's economic structure gives to its working population every day. Don't have a cow. Don't fight the plant. Don't challenge Burns. Don't ask about the three-eyed fish or the glowing billionaire or the skeletons in the basement. Don't connect the dots. Don't organize beyond what the union permits. Don't cost Burns anything he doesn't want to spend. Accept the contamination. Accept the job. Accept the paycheck. Accept the yellow skin and the four fingers, and the fact that your fish have 3 eyes and your children have never aged. Don't have a cow. This is the deal Springfield's workers have been living with since the plant opened. And the radiation theory suggests that the deal has been enforced, partially, by the contamination itself. A population whose neurological function has been compromised by decades of radioactive exposure is less capable of the sustained, organized cognitive engagement that effective labor organizing requires. The contamination that takes the physical toll also reduces the capacity for the kind of collective action that could challenge the source of the contamination. Burns wins on both ends. The labor of the workers funds his operation. The contamination of the workers reduces their capacity to resist his operation. The loop closes. The profits accumulate. The violin that remain unfixed. And every morning, Homer Simpson drives to work at the plant that poisons his town, owned by the man who destroyed his family, clocks in at a job he was given as part of a deal his father made with his enemy, and does whatever the day requires. Because the alternative, in Springfield, in a town built on a contaminated foundation, in a community whose economic existence depends on the continued operation of the source of its contamination, is no alternative at all. Section 16. The things the show almost said, buried storylines and abandoned threads. Every long-running show accumulates them. Storylines that were introduced, developed through an episode or two, and then quietly dropped without resolution. Character arcs that were begun and never completed. Details planted in one season that were apparently forgotten by the next. The machinery of a television production operating at the scale and pace of The Simpsons generates these abandoned threads as a byproduct of its own existence. There are too many episodes, too many writers' rooms, too many seasons for everything to be tracked and followed through to resolution. But some of the abandoned threads in The Simpsons are too specific and too structurally significant to be accidental. The skeletons in the basement of the nuclear plant are the clearest example. They are mentioned. They are shown. Human remains in the sub-levels of a working reactor facility. The show acknowledges their existence during the safety inspection that uncovers the 342 violations. And then nothing. No follow-up. No investigation. No explanation of who those people were, how they came to be dead inside a power plant, whether their deaths were in any way connected to the operations of the facility. In any other context, in any other show, human skeletons in the basement of a place of business would be the beginning of a plot. They would generate questions that the narrative would be obligated to answer. The show acknowledges them and moves on, and Springfield moves on, and nobody asks the questions that the presence of human remains in a nuclear facility clearly demands. The radiation theory reads this as evidence of the most extreme consequences of the plant's safety failures. People died inside that facility, or were brought to it and died there. and the deaths were covered up with the same casual thoroughness that Burns applies to every other inconvenient fact about his operation. The bones are the most visceral, physical evidence of what the plant has cost the people of Springfield, and they are sitting in the basement, acknowledged and never examined. The genetic details of the Simpson family present another abandoned thread that is more significant than the show has chosen to make it. Homer's crayon was lodged in his brain during childhood. This is established, explained, and used as the premise for an episode about what Homer might be without it. What the show never explains is how the crayon got there. A child lodged a writing implement in his own nose deeply enough that it penetrated his brain tissue, and this was not detected by any medical professional during Homer's entire childhood, adolescence, and adult life until he specifically sought out a diagnosis. Either the medical establishment of Springfield is so compromised that it routinely fails to identify objects lodged in patients' brains, which would be consistent with a contamination theory that extends Burns's influence into the healthcare infrastructure of the town, or someone knew about the crayon and chose not to remove it, which is a darker implication that the show planted and then stepped away from. A crayon in a child's brain that reduces his intelligence to a clinical disability level and is left untreated for decades. In a town owned by a man who benefits from having his primary workforce cognitively impaired, left in place by medical professionals who operate within an institution that the contamination theory suggests is compromised. The show never says this directly. It never connects the crayon to Burns. It treats the crayon as an absurd biographical detail that explains Homer's intellectual limitations while being played as comedy. But the detail is there. The implication is available. The thread was laid in the narrative and has never been pulled. The fate of Bleeding Gums Murphy is another abandoned element that deserves more attention than it typically gets. Murphy was Lisa's jazz mentor, an older musician who appeared in the first season and established for Lisa a model of what it looks like to love music so completely that the rest of life becomes secondary to it. He was a fully realized character in his brief appearances, and his eventual death in a later season was treated with genuine emotional weight. What was not treated with emotional weight, or with any real resolution, was the question of what his music meant and what happened to his legacy. He made a record. The record exists in the show's canon. It was never commercially successful in any way that the show depicts. Murphy died with his music unmourned in the way that most art by most people goes unmourned, regardless of its quality. This is thematically consistent with what the show says about Lisa's situation. Brilliant people in Springfield do not get recognition proportional to their brilliance. The systems that should identify and elevate exceptional talent are either absent or compromised. Murphy's music was good enough to change Lisa's life. It was not good enough to escape Springfield's gravitational pull toward the mediocre. The thread of what happened to his music, whether any record of it survives outside Lisa's memory, is never followed. The show planted it and moved on. There is also the matter of Apu. Apu Nahasapi Mapatilon ran the Quick E-Mart for over 2 decades of the show's run. He was a significant supporting character, present in enough episodes to have accumulated a genuine history with the main cast. He had a family, he had a business, he had a complicated relationship with the economic pressures of small business ownership and the cultural displacement of an immigrant trying to maintain identity while navigating the particular social environment of Springfield. And then he was quietly written out of the show following a public controversy about the portrayal of Indian American characters in animation. His departure from the narrative was not a storyline, it was a fade. He appeared less and less frequently, and then he was essentially not there, and the show did not acknowledge his absence or provide any resolution for the character who had been present for such a long time. This is not a mystery in the way that the skeletons are a mystery. The real-world explanation for what happened to Apu is documented and widely understood. But within the fictional world of Springfield, the disappearance of a character who was present for 20-plus years without explanation or acknowledgement is its own kind of abandonment. Under the collective denial theory, it is almost too perfect an example of Springfield's mechanism in action. The community has simply agreed not to notice that someone is gone. The social contract of forgetting has been applied to a person. The show's relationship with its own abandoned threads is, in many ways, a microcosm of Springfield's relationship with its own uncomfortable truths. They are noted, glimpsed, briefly present in the foreground, and then moved to the background, where they continue to exist without being examined. The bones are in the basement. The crayon is in the brain. The musician's record is somewhere in the world. The neighbor who was always at the Quick E-Mart is somewhere that the camera does not visit anymore. Springfield does not resolve its buried things. It accumulates them. And the accumulation, across 36 years and 788 episodes, is staggering. The show's enormous volume is its greatest asset for fan theorizing, precisely because so much has been planted and never resolved. The sheer quantity of detail in the archive means that connections are available to anyone patient enough to look for them. The buried threads can be woven into new patterns by viewers willing to do the weaving that the show itself declined to do. This is, in its way, the most generous thing the show has ever done for its audience. It gave them the threads, it left them buried, and it trusted that the people watching closely enough would find them and know what to do with them. The mysteries of Springfield are not mysteries that the show failed to solve. They are mysteries that the show deliberately left unsolved, because an audience with unsolved mysteries is an audience that keeps coming back. The loop keeps turning. The bones stay in the basement. The crayon stays in the brain. And somewhere, in the archive of 36 years of Springfield, every answer is waiting to be found by someone willing to look long enough and carefully enough and in the right places. End of script. Total approximate running time at audiobook pace, 4 hours 30 minutes. Total word count, approximately 42,000 plus words. Section 17. The religion of Springfield faith, God, and the theology of a contaminated world. Springfield is a religious town. Not in the sense that its residents practice faith in ways that would satisfy any formal theological standard. Homer sleeps through church. The congregation at the First Church of Springfield is composed largely of people who appear to be there out of social obligation rather than spiritual conviction. The town's relationship with organized religion is exactly what you would expect from a community whose relationship with all institutions is filtered through layers of indifference, mild corruption, and the general fog that the contamination theory would predict. But God is real in Springfield. This is not a metaphor and it is not a question. God has appeared in the show. God has spoken to Homer. God has taken a form that the show depicts with enough specificity and consistency that within the world of Springfield, the existence of a divine being with something like a personality is an established fact. God is large. He has 5 fingers, which is one of the show's most pointed running jokes. God, uniquely among all beings who appear in Springfield, has the correct number of digits. Every Springfield resident has 4. God has 5. The implication, which the show allows to sit in the frame without comment, is either that God was not exposed to the same contamination that produced the 4-fingered population of Springfield, or that God's biology is not subject to the same mutations that affect mortal organisms. Neither of these interpretations is fully comfortable, and the show does not try to make them comfortable. It simply places a 5-fingered God in a 4-fingered world and leaves the arithmetic for the audience to contemplate. God talks to Homer. We have established this. God has not, within the show's canon, talked to Ned Flanders, who has devoted his life to faith with a sincerity that the show treats as real rather than satirical. This asymmetry is one of the show's most consistent and most quietly devastating theological statements. The drunk who falls asleep in church gets divine conversation. The devout man who has organized his entire existence around his faith gets silence. Within the logic of the show's universe, what does this say about the nature of God as Springfield experiences him? One reading is simply comedic. God finds Homer more interesting than Ned because Homer is more interesting to everyone than Ned. The argument that the universe distributes its attention in proportion to entertainment value is consistent with how The Simpsons generally works as a piece of narrative art. But there is a darker reading available. God in Springfield operates according to the same logic that everything else in Springfield operates according to, not merit, not righteousness, not the correspondence between effort and reward that all conventional theological frameworks are built around. Something else. Something more arbitrary. Something that has less to do with what Ned has done or what Homer has done, and more to do with the structural position each of them occupies in the narrative of the town. Homer is at the center of the story. He is the subject around whom Springfield's events organize themselves. He is, in the language of narrative theory, the protagonist. And the protagonist gets the divine attention, the miraculous survivals, the impossible rescues, not because he has earned them, but because the story requires him to have them. Ned is not the protagonist. He is the foil, the contrast, the character whose goodness makes Homer's ordinariness more visible by comparison. The story does not require Ned to have divine attention. His function in the narrative is served by his faithfulness in the absence of confirmation, by his continued practice in the face of a silence that is not incidental but structurally determined. This is the cruelest possible theological statement the show could make, and it makes it with the same offhandedness it brings to everything. God does not speak to Ned because the story does not need God to speak to Ned. Ned's faith is the more admirable because it is sustained without response. But the admirable thing and the rewarded thing are not the same in Springfield. The Reverend Lovejoy is another element of Springfield's religious landscape that deserves more attention than he usually gets. He is the pastor of the First Church of Springfield, and the show has established across many episodes that his relationship to his vocation has, over time, drained from something that might once have been genuine into something that is essentially professional. He performs his ministry, he gives his sermons, he provides the services that the social role of a pastor requires. But the fire, if it was ever there, is not visible in the version of Lovejoy the show has developed. There is an episode in which Lovejoy admits that Ned Flanders has essentially driven him out of his faith through the relentlessness of his needs. Ned calls Lovejoy for pastoral support with a frequency and an intensity that has worn down whatever spiritual reserves the Reverend was maintaining. This is played as comedy. Ned is too much for even his pastor. But in the context of everything the show has established about Ned, it is something else. Ned genuinely needs spiritual support. He is genuinely suffering in ways that the psychological cage of his conditioning has prevented him from processing through normal emotional channels, and he has turned to his pastor because his pastor is supposed to be the resource for exactly that kind of need. And the pastor has burned out on him. The institutional church in Springfield cannot provide Ned with what Ned actually needs. The institution, like every other institution in Springfield, is operating under the same constraints that everything in the town operates under. Lovejoy's burned-out ministry is as much a product of Springfield's contaminated environment as Homer's cognitive impairment or the three-eyed fish. Not contaminated by radiation specifically, but by the general atmosphere of a community whose capacity for authentic engagement with difficult things has been so thoroughly compromised that even its spiritual life has become a performance. Ned's faith is the only genuinely alive religious practice in Springfield, and it is alive precisely because it is not supported by anything. Not by divine confirmation, not by pastoral support, not by a community of fellow believers who engage with their faith at the level Ned does. It is alive because Ned keeps it alive through sheer personal will, the only form of will he has reliably been able to exercise since his conditioning removed all the others. There is something in this that connects to the broader question of what Springfield is and what it does to the people who live in it. The town has a talent for taking sincere things and wearing them down. Lovejoy's sincere vocation wore down to professional habit. Ned's sincere goodness was revealed to be conditioned behavior. Homer's sincere intelligence, briefly restored when the crayon was removed, was too painful to maintain. The sincere reform of every civic institution in Springfield is undone by the next episode. Sincerity cannot survive in Springfield without becoming something else. Without being transformed by the weight of the environment into a performance, a habit, a coping mechanism, or a casualty, Ned's faith survives because Ned is, in his specific and particular way, the only person in Springfield whose sincerity is strong enough to outlast the town's tendency to erode it. His faith is the most durable thing in Springfield precisely because it asks nothing of the environment and receives nothing from it. It does not depend on the water being clean or the air being uncontaminated or the institutions being functional or God answering. It is self-sustaining in a way that nothing else in the town manages to be. This is why Ned Flanders is, despite everything the show does to him, ultimately the character who suggests the most about what human capacity looks like at its most resilient. Not Homer's survivability, which is passive and biologically inexplicable. Not Burns's longevity, which is engineered and purchased. Ned's faith, which is maintained through nothing but Ned's own will in the face of a universe that consistently fails to reward it. In a town where everything erodes, that is remarkable. It does not make him happy, but it makes him, in a specific and limited way, the freest person in Springfield. The one person whose interior life does not depend on what the town provides, or what Burns allows, or what the contamination permits. He keeps faith with a practice that has never spoken back to him, and he will keep faith with it long after everyone else in Springfield has forgotten that there was ever anything worth keeping faith with. Section 18. The show that changed television. What the Simpsons built and what it left behind. The Simpsons did not invent the animated sitcom. The Flintstones predates it by nearly 30 years. Animated television for adults had existed in various forms since animation itself was young. The genre had a history before the 17th of December, 1989. But The Simpsons changed what animated television was capable of. And the change was so comprehensive and so lasting that it is nearly impossible now to look at the landscape of adult animation without seeing The Simpsons in every corner of it. Before The Simpsons, animated television for adult audiences was either adventure programming or comedy that operated at a level of sophistication roughly consistent with what animation's reputation at the time permitted. The medium was not considered appropriate for the kind of character-driven, emotionally resonant, satirically complex storytelling that The Simpsons brought to it in its first few seasons. The show changed that assumption by demonstrating that animation was not a limitation but a tool. A tool that, in the right hands, could do things that live-action television could not. Characters who could survive physical comedy that would require expensive practical effects in live action. Visual jokes that operated at a speed and a specificity that live performance could not sustain. A freedom from the constraints of physical production that allowed the show's creators to build Springfield into the most completely realized fictional town in the history of American television, with a geography that expanded as needed and a population that grew episode by episode without the logistical complications of hiring new actors for every new face. The show created a template, not just for adult animation, but for what television comedy could be when it took its characters seriously and its world-building seriously and its audience seriously, even while it maintained the absurdism and the irreverence that made it a comedy rather than a drama. Every adult animated series that came after The Simpsons is in some relationship with it. Some are explicitly influenced. Some are reactions against elements of it. Some have developed in directions that the original show could not have anticipated. But the conversation they are all having is a conversation that The Simpsons started. South Park arrived in 1997, during the period when The Simpsons had already begun its shift toward the more surreal post-coma sensibility that fans have debated for decades. South Park took the social satire of The Simpsons and pushed it in a direction that was more confrontational, more willing to engage with current events at the speed of news rather than the slower pace of television production, and more interested in provocation for its own sake. Family Guy arrived in 1999 and drew from the same well of animated family comedy while developing its own particular relationship to narrative structure. One that was more deliberately fragmented and more comfortable with non sequitur, in ways that reflected the internet culture beginning to develop around the show's production period. Futurama arrived the same year and took the science fiction element of The Simpsons' more adventurous post-coma episodes and made it the central premise rather than an occasional excursion. The emotional depth that had defined the early Simpsons was preserved and applied to a genuinely imaginative world-building project. All of these shows are in conversation with The Simpsons. None of them would exist in the form they do without it. And all of them represent aspects of what The Simpsons was or could have been, extrapolated in different directions by different creative teams with different priorities. But The Simpsons was first, and in the particular domain it established, the animated family sitcom anchored to a specific community with a specific economic and social reality, it has never been surpassed. Other shows have done specific things better. They have been sharper, darker, more formally experimental, more willing to pursue certain kinds of darkness or comedy to their extremes. But the combination of qualities that defines The Simpsons at its best, the emotional authenticity, the satirical intelligence, the world-building depth, the genuine affection for its characters even when it is at its most merciless with them, has not been matched. This is why the theories exist. This is why people who have been watching the show for 36 years are still finding new things to say about it, still building new frameworks for understanding what Springfield is and what it means. A show that did not matter would not generate this kind of sustained attention. A show that was merely entertaining would not inspire this kind of investment in understanding it. The Simpsons inspires the theorizing because it built a world substantial enough to theorize about, rich enough to sustain examination, contradictory enough to generate questions, and emotionally resonant enough to make the answering of those questions feel like something worth doing. The show changed television, and the change was not just in what animated television could be. It was in what television comedy could say about the conditions of American life, and the institutions that shape it, and the families that navigate it, and the communities that both sustain and damage the people who live in them. The nuclear power plant is not a background detail. The contamination is not a gag premise. The billionaire who cannot remember his employee's name is not a comedy villain. They are elements of a portrait of American economic and institutional life that is accurate enough that 36 years of audience engagement have not rendered it outdated. Springfield is still recognizable. The plant is still leaking. Burns is still alive. Homer is still working for the man who destroyed his family without quite being able to understand how that happened or why. And every Sunday night, or whenever you come to it, a family sits down on a couch, in a house on Evergreen Terrace, in a town that does not appear on any map, and the television comes on, and the loop turns one more time. That is the legacy. That is what The Simpsons built. A loop that has been running for 36 years and shows no sign of stopping. A town that has been dreamed for so long that it has become, in the imagination of everyone who has spent time in it, something almost like real. A family that has been preserved in amber for so long that they feel, to the audience that has grown up around them, like something between fiction and memory. And a set of questions buried in the structure of the show itself that have been waiting since 1989 for someone patient enough to sit in the dark and ask them. Tonight, we ask some of them. Tomorrow night, when you come back, the rest of them will still be there. Springfield always is. Good night. Final word count, 41,000 plus words. Estimated runtime at 130 words per minute narration pace. Approximately 5 hours, 15 minutes. Section 918. The secondary characters who carry the weight Springfield's forgotten people. There is a version of Springfield that the main storylines do not show you. It exists in the margins of the frame, in the background of the crowd shots, in the recurring faces that populate the school and the bar and the power plant and the church and the grocery store and the police station. These are the people who make Springfield feel like a real place rather than a set. They are the texture of the town. And many of them are carrying stories that the show has sketched in and never completed, lives that the camera has acknowledged and then moved past, histories that are implied by their behavior and their appearances, and the things they say in the moments before the scene returns to The Simpsons. Chief Clancy Wiggum is perhaps the most developed of these secondary characters, and his development tells a specific story about Springfield's institutions that the main plot rarely addresses directly. Wiggum is, by every professional standard, one of the most catastrophically inadequate law enforcement officials in the history of fictional policing. He is slow, he is easily confused. He makes decisions that are not just wrong, but wrong in ways that require a specific and impressive failure of basic reasoning. He has, over the course of the show's run, mishandled every significant investigation the Springfield Police Department has undertaken, including the Burns shooting, which he resolved by accepting the identification of a baby as the perpetrator and declaring the case closed because babies cannot be prosecuted. The radiation theory offers a specific framing for Wiggum's inadequacy. He is not performing badly because he is lazy or uncaring, though the show depicts him as both of those things to some degree. He is performing badly because his cognitive function has been compromised by the same contaminated environment that has compromised everyone else in Springfield. Wiggum is the chief of police of a town whose entire population, including him, has been exposed to neurotoxic contamination for decades. His failures as a law enforcement professional are consistent with what chronic radiation exposure does to the brain functions that law enforcement requires: careful observation, logical reasoning, sustained attention to relevant detail. Wiggum cannot do his job well because the contamination has undermined the cognitive tools his job requires. This does not make him less dangerous. It makes him more dangerous, in the particular way that incompetent institutional power is always more dangerous than competent power. Because incompetent power is unpredictable and unaccountable in ways that competent power at least has some chance of being held to standards. Springfield's police force, under Wiggum's leadership, is neither an effective check on crime nor a reliable instrument of justice. It is a source of additional chaos in a town that generates chaos at a rate that exceeds the capacity of any institutional response. And Burns, who has the resources to ensure that any investigation of his operations goes nowhere, has in Wiggum the ideal chief of police, someone who will not, through any combination of effort and intelligence, ever arrive at conclusions that threaten the plant or its owner. Sideshow Bob deserves attention in the context of Springfield's secondary characters because he represents something unusual in the show's world, a character who is genuinely intelligent, who has the kind of elite educational background and sophisticated intellectual capacity that should place him in a category far above most of Springfield's residents, and who has nonetheless been broken by the town in his own specific way. Bob's intelligence is real. His education is real. His cultural sophistication, his love of opera and literature and classical architecture and the finer things that Springfield consistently fails to provide is real. He is, in any objective assessment, one of the most capable people in the show. He is also a man who has spent decades trying to kill a 10-year-old child and failing every time. The gap between Bob's capacity and his actual accomplishments is Springfield in miniature. The town has this talent for taking people who should be able to accomplish extraordinary things and directing that capacity into channels that are either destructive or futile. Lisa cannot get her intelligence recognized by the people around her. Bob cannot kill Bart. Homer cannot connect the dots of his own life. Every form of excellence or capability in Springfield is channeled somewhere it cannot produce useful outcomes. Under the coma theory, Bob is one of the most interesting presences in Homer's dream. He is a figure of genuine menace directed at the thing Homer loves most, which is his family. He is the threat to Bart that Homer's unconscious mind generates in order to have something for the Dreamtown's protective instincts to work against. Every foiled Sideshow Bob plan is the dream's way of having Homer save his son repeatedly across decades from a threat that never actually succeeds because the dream does not allow it to succeed. The dream generates the threat in order to generate the resolution. Bob chases Bart so that Homer can know, episode after episode, that Bart is safe, that the family is intact, that the protective love of a father is still functioning even from inside the hospital bed where the father lies unconscious and unreachable. Milhouse Van Houten is the character who most clearly represents what Springfield does to sensitive children who do not have either Bart's charisma or Lisa's intelligence to protect them from the town's indifference. Milhouse is vulnerable. He is easily frightened, easily manipulated, frequently hurt, and almost constitutionally incapable of protecting himself from the casual cruelties that a childhood in Springfield produces. He is loyal to Bart in a way that consistently costs him more than it costs Bart. He is in love with Lisa in a way that the show has sustained as a running joke for the entire series without ever quite resolving, because resolving it would require either affirming or denying that Milhouse deserves the thing he has been pursuing. The show's treatment of Milhouse is, in many ways, its treatment of a certain kind of person. The one who never quite fits, never quite succeeds, never quite gets the thing they want, but keeps trying with an earnestness that the cynical environment around them has not been able to eliminate. Springfield should have broken Milhouse completely. His parents divorced. His home life is unstable. His social position is precarious. His closest friendship with Bart, which is the most important relationship in his life, is fundamentally asymmetrical in ways that consistently disadvantage him. And he keeps going, glasses and all, with the particular determination of someone who has not yet been told, in terms he can fully understand and accept, that this is not going to work out the way he hopes. This is perhaps the most Springfieldian thing about Milhouse. Not his specific failures, which are consistent and well documented, but his persistence in the face of them. The town should have produced either someone broken or someone adapted. Milhouse is neither. He is still trying, still hoping, still showing up. There is something in this that connects to what the show says about ordinary persistence in a contaminated environment. The big gestures are Homer and Burns and the theories about comas and radiation and immortality. The texture of Springfield is Milhouse, still there, still trying, still not giving up on things that rational assessment would advise giving up on. And it is, in its own modest way, remarkable. Springfield's secondary characters are its conscience, its texture, its proof that the world of the show is more than the family at its center. They are the people who live the same contaminated life as The Simpsons, without the narrative protection of being the show's primary subjects. They get sick, they get old, they get broken by the same forces that the main characters survive. And they keep going. Because in Springfield, keeping going is the only option the town reliably makes available. The loop turns for them too. Every episode, every week. The same faces in the background of the Quickie Mart and the school and the power plant and the church, living the same contaminated lives, neither understanding nor questioning the conditions of their existence, doing what Springfield's residents have always done, accepting, persisting, and somehow improbably still being there when the next episode starts. Section 20. The end of every episode and why it matters. Every episode of The Simpsons ends. This sounds obvious enough to be useless as an observation, but follow the logic of it for a moment, because it opens onto something significant. Every episode ends with things returned to the status quo. The catastrophe is resolved, the crisis is averted, the misunderstanding is corrected, the adventure is concluded. Homer comes home, the family is together, the house is intact. Whatever the episode threatened to change has not changed. The couch is still there, the television is still on, everything is as it was before the episode began. This is the reset. This is the mechanism that every long-running sitcom employs to allow the show to continue episode after episode without the accumulation of consequence that would eventually limit what stories the writers could tell. Real life accumulates. Fiction, when it needs to, resets. But The Simpsons has been doing this for 36 years. 36 years of resets, at a pace of roughly 22 episodes per season, across 36 seasons. The number of times Springfield has been returned to baseline, the number of crises that were resolved by the next episode's cold open, the number of consequence-free catastrophes that have been survived and forgotten is astronomical. And the show is aware of this. It has always been aware of this. The self-referential humor that the show developed during its middle seasons often included jokes about exactly this dynamic, about the way the show's world resets, about the impossibility of consequences sticking in a narrative universe that requires characters to be available for the next episode. But the awareness of the mechanism does not change the mechanism. Every episode still ends the same way. Homer comes home. This is the baseline. This is the zero state that every episode returns the world to before the next episode can begin. Homer in the house, with the family, in the position that is his position in the structure of the world. Whatever happened during the 22 minutes of narrative time just elapsed, whatever he survived, experienced, accomplished, failed, or destroyed, the episode ends with him home. This is not just a structural convention. Within the logic of the coma theory, it is the entire point. Homer's dreaming mind is not generating Springfield to produce adventure narratives or satirical comedy or social observation. It is generating Springfield to produce, at the end of every cycle, one image. Homer home. The family together, the house intact, everyone safe. Every episode is a path back to that image. Every adventure is a detour that the dream constructs in order to make the return meaningful, because the return is meaningful only if there was something to return from. The coma dream does not simply give Homer a frozen moment of domestic peace. It gives him the experience of earning the peace, over and over, through whatever the episode required of him. The repetition of this is not the show being lazy. It is the dream being specific about what the dreamer most needs. Homer needs to come home. He needs to experience repeatedly, across decades, the particular warmth and relief of returning to the house on Evergreen Terrace and finding it as he left it, the family present, the children safe, Marge there. Under the radiation theory, the reset is a symptom of the neurological damage that prevents Springfield's residents from accumulating memory in the normal way. The town forgets catastrophes because the brains of its residents are unable to retain information in the sustained way that would allow consequences to persist. Every reset is evidence of the contamination working as it works, preventing the kind of sustained memory that would enable accountability. Under the principle and the pauper theory, the reset is the social contract operating as designed. The community votes, at the end of each episode, to forget. to return to the agreed-upon version of reality, to treat the catastrophe as having not occurred in any way that needs to be carried forward. Under the coma theory, the reset is the structure of the dream. Dreams do not maintain continuity between cycles. When you wake from one dream and fall into another, the previous dream does not inform the new one in the way that experiences inform each other in waking life. Each episode dream begins from baseline because that is how dreaming works. 3 different theories, 3 different mechanisms, the same outcome. Every episode ends with Homer home, and that outcome, that specific and recurring resolution, is what the show is ultimately about, not the adventures, not the celebrity appearances, not the impossible survivals or the elaborate schemes or the social satire or the fan theories or the predictions or the mysteries. The return. The door of 742 Evergreen Terrace opening, and the family inside, and the particular quality of light in that living room that is the same in every episode, the same couch and the same television and the same faces in the same positions, waiting. Homer always comes home. He has always come home, even if home is a dream. Even if the man driving toward it is lying in a hospital bed in a town that no one can find on a map. Even if the children who will greet him have not aged a single day in 36 years, even if the house is made of contamination and fantasy and the collective decision of an entire town to pretend that certain things are not what they are, Homer comes home. The credits roll. The loop turns, and Springfield waits, as it always has, as it always will, for as long as we keep watching, for as long as the loop needs us to. Good night from Springfield. We will be here when you come back.